"Get out of the way," he shouted, his hand clenched into a fist before she could respond. "This is a public path," she replied, eyes unblinking, voice steady. "I didn't ask you." The punch sliced the air, and blood hit the market floor. She didn't scream. She just stood up, slowly. "I'm your superior." And that was the moment the whole system started to tremble. The line stretched along the central market path, each footstep shoulder to shoulder in the rush of a lively weekend morning. The scent of red apples drifted from the fruit stall near the entrance, mingling with the rhythmic chop of a butcher's knife and the clatter of a card reader at the pastry counter. Joelle Ferris stood fifth in line, eyes on the young vendor placing apples into paper bags. No one noticed her. Just a middle-aged black woman in a striped gray coat, slightly worn shoes, frizzy hair tied back, a high collar nearly covering her neck. She stood upright, hands folded calmly in front, not flustered, not drawing attention, a quiet figure like so many others in the market, until the sharp slam of a police car door echoed from the far end of the aisle. A heavy thud, then a man's voice cut through the rhythm of the market. "You there, move out of the way." All heads turned. Kurt Halley strode from the patrol car, dark blue uniform, name tag catching the sunlight, authority in his shoulders, chin lifted as he walked toward Joelle. People stepped aside, instinctively avoiding trouble. Joelle didn't move. She turned to him, her voice steady. "This is a public path." Kurt paused for a beat, then snarled, "I didn't ask your opinion. Are you staying put, or do you want your neck locked?" Before the last word landed, his fist swung straight at her face. A collective gasp caught in the crowd's throat. A woman backed into a wall, hand over her mouth, eyes wide. Joelle hit the stone floor, her back crashing into a basket of oranges, blood spilling from her mouth and trickling down her chin. She pushed herself up, breathing deeply. No one stepped forward. Everyone stayed still, as if this kind of act wasn't unusual here. A boy clung to his mother and whispered, "Mom, why did that man hit her?" The mother pulled him close, avoiding eye contact. Kurt stepped in, yanked Joelle's arms behind her back, and the cold clink of handcuffs snapped loudly. "Don't look at me like that. Who do you people think you are?" His breath hit her neck, stale coffee and cigarettes. Joelle pressed her lips tight, voice low. "You're abusing your authority." Kurt growled into her ear, "I am the authority. Around here, I'm the law." A woman in sunglasses across the aisle pulled out her phone, thumb flicking quickly to start recording. She tilted her head, asked the person beside her, "Who is she?" Kurt hauled Joelle to her feet and shoved her toward the patrol car. She leaned slightly but didn't resist. The car door wouldn't open. He barked into the radio for the handcuff key, yanked her bag off her shoulder and threw it to the ground. "What's in here? Fake IDs? Stolen badge?" His voice was louder than necessary, like he wanted the crowd to hear. Joelle sat on the curb, quietly picking up each item that had spilled. A bank card, car keys, a worn leather phone. Kurt kicked the items farther each time she reached for one, but she kept bending down, one by one, saying nothing. When she picked up her ID card, Kurt laughed. "You think you're special?" He looked her straight in the eye. "You weren't born to stand equal to the police." From behind, a young man with long hair raised his phone, pointing it directly at them. "What did he just say? Did that get recorded?" he asked loudly enough for a few others in the crowd to take notice. Another patrol car arrived. Lieutenant Jansen stepped out, tall and lean, shirt unbuttoned at the collar, radio slung over his shoulder. He walked slowly, scanning the scene, then smirked when he saw Joelle in cuffs. "What kind of suspect looks this good?" he said, more mocking than angry. Joelle lifted her head, blood still on her lips, and spoke calmly. "I'm your superior." Jensen raised an eyebrow, then burst out laughing, hands on his hip. "Oh, we're playing pretend now? Superior?" Kurt nodded, glancing at Jensen. "Probably learned some reverse psychology trick somewhere. Pretending to be the boss. These people are slick." Joelle asked to open her wallet. Jensen stepped closer and said loudly, "Careful, she's probably got a gun." The crowd stepped back a few more paces. Joelle opened the wallet with 2 fingers, slowly pulled out a black leather badge case, and held it up to Jensen. The card read, Police Chief, Urban Crime Unit. Jensen took it, stared at it. A heavy second passed. Then he laughed again. Where'd you get this printed? Etsy? His voice echoed down the market aisle. Kurt snatched the card, glanced at it, and tossed it back into her bag. An old man stepped forward from the orange stall, still holding a peeling knife. She's real. She's your chief. I've met her. His voice was firm, not loud, but it rang out like a gavel strike. Jensen turned to Kurt. Kurt said nothing. His face tightened, fists clenched. No one in the crowd moved anymore. Phones were raised from every direction. No one spoke, but everyone was waiting to see what would happen now that those who doubted had been handed proof they couldn't deny. Joelle was still sitting there, hands cuffed behind her back, blood on her face, eyes dry, but no one saw her as just someone anymore. No one was confused now, and no one dared call her that woman like they had minutes ago. The market stayed silent. The only sound was from phone cameras recording each breath, each retreating step, each glance shifting from suspicion to shame. This was no longer a personal conflict. It had become a small historic moment, one that began with an empty command and ended in a silence no one could lift. And in that silence, something started to tremble. Not the market, not Joelle, but the foundation beneath those who thought they stood above. Joelle hit the tiled sidewalk hard, her back scraping against the uneven surface, one cheek burning red, a thin line of blood trickling from the corner of her mouth down to her chin. The faint metallic smell slipped into her nose as the crowd around her remained motionless, as if the scene were too familiar to demand a reaction. A 6-year-old boy stood beside his mother, gripping her cross-body bag, his voice small but clear in the silence. Mom, why did that man hit her? The mother didn't answer, just placed her hand on his head and squeezed gently. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. No arms were raised. The only movement came from one person, Kurt Halley. He bent down, yanking Joelle's arms behind her back, his grip crushing her wrists like he meant to splinter bone. His knee pressed into her lower back, forcing her into a position no one should endure unless they had taken a life. Don't look at me like that, he hissed through clenched teeth, his breath thick with burnt coffee and old smoke. You people think you're somebody, huh? Stand up straight and think you matter? Joelle closed her eyes for a second, pulling order back into her head, then opened them toward the space in front of her. Her shoes were now dusty, and the ground below was etched with flattened gum and boot prints. Her voice wasn't loud nor bitter, but carried the weight of someone who had said these words too many times without anyone listening. You're abusing your power. The line, simple as it was, made him pause briefly, then laugh, a laugh not meant for conversation or reason. Abuse of power? He whispered, leaning closer. I am powerful. Around here, I'm the law. Across the street, a woman in amber-tinted sunglasses raised her phone, pointing it toward Joelle. A light breeze pushed her long hair back, revealing eyes caught between curiosity and confusion. She tilted her head, brushing shoulders with the man beside her. Who is she? She asked. He didn't respond. Eyes locked on Kurt and Joelle, as if watching a street performance no one asked for. Kurt stood and dragged Joelle up like she was a sandbag. Her arms were locked behind her, one shoulder already strained from the fall. She didn't resist, but her stance stayed upright. Her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for who dared meet her gaze, who was recording, who was just watching. Kurt pulled her toward the front of the patrol car, stopping near the bus stop. The people waiting there rose quietly, stepping aside without asking why. You think you'll get sympathy? Kurt said loudly, looking around as if giving a speech in a plaza. All of you think just because you dress neat and walk straight, nobody can touch you? He paused, shifted left, and locked eyes with her. You're not special. Around here, your skin says more than you ever will. Joelle stayed silent. She looked toward the traffic camera mounted on the pole, knowing it captured no sound, only movement. Maybe enough to prove something, or maybe not. A young man in a white t-shirt stepped out of the convenience store across the street, holding a can of soda, and caught the scene instantly. He froze for a moment, watching, then pulled his phone from his back pocket. He didn't start recording right away, but opened a live stream app and typed a headline in bold. Police just punched a black woman at the farmer's market. Once the stream stabilized, he slowly panned the camera, starting with Joelle's face, moving over the handcuffs, then gradually to Kurt standing with his legs apart, hands on his hips. "What's happening here?" he said into the mic, as much to the viewers as to himself. At the front of the apple line, a vendor turned to an assistant and spoke loudly enough for nearby shoppers to hear. "I've seen her on the news. She might be a cop." The assistant said nothing. But moments later, the clicks of phone cameras filled the air. Every angle told a piece of the story. Every raised hand said the same thing. "I saw it." Joelle was pushed against the patrol car, her back pressed to the cold metal, one side of her forehead still slick with blood. Kurt leaned down and pulled the small pouch from her hip, opening it in full view. He emptied it onto the hood of the car. A bank card, a paper bag with receipts, a small notebook of personal notes, and an ID badge with no visible agency. "What's this?" He held the badge up to her face, the light catching its glossy surface. "Where'd you steal this from? Who are you pretending to be?" Joelle didn't respond. She watched him like someone watching the 20th rerun of a tired scene. An older woman with gray-streaked hair, dressed in a light autumn coat, stood still at the edge of the sidewalk, her hands clutching the straps of her cloth bag. She looked at Joelle for a long moment, then stepped back and gently tapped the arm of the man beside her. "I think I saw her at a conference. She's not just anybody." The man shook his head. "Whether she is or not, she still got punched." The words didn't carry spite, just landed like a quiet, sad truth. Kurt was starting to lose patience. He turned to Joelle and said through his teeth, "You think silence is power? You think I'm afraid of you? No one's coming to save you. Out here, everyone's just watching. No one's helping." Joelle tilted her head slightly, not to dodge him, but as if taking in the crowd's reaction. Some lowered their eyes. Some slipped away, but a few phones were still raised. And when her gaze settled on a girl about 12, standing near the curb with her mother, their eyes locked. The girl didn't look away. Joelle pressed her lips together. Another gust of wind lifted the girl's hair and made the edge of Joelle's coat flutter. By now, the cuffs in Kurt's hand were tight. He didn't know her name, didn't know who she was, but that didn't matter to him. To him, her actions, standing tall, unafraid, unpermitted, were a threat enough. And for him, as he had already made clear, power was something you invent, not something you have to prove. A white man walked by, paused for half a second, then took out his phone. He didn't record, just typed a message into a chat app. "I think I just saw her. That woman is Joelle Ferris. She's the police chief who was appointed last month." The message was sent in silence, but it sparked a quiet flame in an already stifling atmosphere. While Kurt kept rambling on about disrespect and resisting an officer, messages, comments, and glances began to shift. Someone remembered that face from the swearing-in ceremony. Someone recognized that voice from a radio interview, and someone began to realize that the punch wasn't meant for an anonymous civilian. It had just landed on the mask of a system used to dismissing people's existence. Joelle stood there, handcuffed, insulted, blood not yet dry. But in that unbroken silence, with her stillness unwavering, people began to see more clearly who was truly controlling the air, and who was about to lose the power they thought would last forever. The charcoal handbag lay crumpled beside the patrol car, its strap torn, the fabric roughened from being yanked too hard. Kurt bent down and pulled it out like he was extracting suspicious evidence from a crime scene. He didn't ask for cooperation, gave no warning, wore no gloves, and offered no reason. He unzipped it and dumped everything out right in the middle of the walkway. On the hood of the car lay a wallet, tissues, a phone, a scuffed plastic card holder, and a bundle of loose papers tied with a rubber band. He kicked the bag aside and spoke loudly, as if lecturing a class of new recruits. "What's in here? Fake documents? Stolen badge? Who are you trying to play pretend with?" Joelle didn't answer. She stepped toward the pile, bent slightly, and began picking up each item with her left hand, since her right was still cuffed. A receipt slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground. When she bent to retrieve it, Kurt pressed the edge of the paper under his boot. She didn't flinch or look up, just waited a beat, then quietly waited for him to move before continuing. Each item she picked up became another interruption from him. Every quiet movement from her was a refusal to yield, and it was that silence that agitated him, not because she resisted, but because she wasn't afraid, the way he wanted her to be. Kurt circled around, bent down, and picked up the plastic ID from the case. He held it up, voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're somebody? So your name's on this? What does it prove? You weren't born to stand equal to the police." His voice rang through the market like a slap to the face. A few people flinched. A young white woman filming nearby let out a breath and gripped her phone tightly. A man across the aisle stepped back, then opened a live stream app, filming as he muttered in disbelief, "What did he just say? Did we get that?" The question wasn't directed at anyone in particular, but it sparked a chain reaction. More phones came out. Some people opened their cameras without hitting record, still hesitating between staying silent and stepping in. Joelle picked up her phone and slid it into her coat pocket, then bent to gather a stack of note pages that had come loose. The writing was round and neat, bullet points in blue ink. No one could see the content clearly, but it was easy to guess. A work journal, draft schedules, the kind of notes a high-level professional carries while working on the move. Kurt looked at the papers like they were weapons, then growled, "You using this stuff to fake a title? What, the slick operators downtown been teaching you how to roll gay now?" A whisper stirred near the produce stand. Someone said, "I swear she was at the opening ceremony for the new investigations unit last month. I even shook her hand." Another voice replied, "If that's true, this is serious." Confusion spread. A few people turned to one another as if trying to confirm their memories, while others began searching for Joelle's name online. Every tap on a phone now felt like part of a quiet investigation unfolding right there in the middle of the market. Joelle looked at Kurt once, not long, not with weight, but just enough to make him glance away. She said nothing, and it was that space between words that made his insults fall flat. When a middle-aged man in a suit walked by and stopped at the sight, he asked a market security guard, "What's going on here?" The guard answered quietly, "Police detained a woman. They say she was impersonating someone." The man stared for a few seconds, then silently took out his phone, not to make a call, but to search for the name Joelle Ferris. Kurt wasn't done. He grabbed a stiff ID from her wallet, held it to his face, then thrust it toward the crowd and shouted, "Look at this! Look at this fake badge. Look at how people like her try to pretend they matter." A nearby group of students stood frozen, and one young woman whispered, "I've seen that badge, exactly that one, at the last criminal justice reform talk." People began turning to each other. "Really? Are you sure? This just got serious." An old man selling used books at the curb raised his hand and called softly, "That woman bought books from me. She had a police badge on her then. I couldn't forget that." His voice wasn't loud, but his eyes were steady. In the thickening air of scattered testimonies and rushed clips, Joelle's image started to rise, not yet officially recognized, but already dismissed in the street. The child suddenly asked his mother, if she really is a cop, why did that man still hit her? The question didn't come at the right moment, but no one contradicted it. A woman quietly typed it down, then posted the words on a black background with a short clip. If she's real, why was she punched? The question was simple, but it hit the exact center of the storm forming ahead. People started pulling out their phones, not to record, but to share. Joelle picked up the fallen card case, returned each item to her bag. She said nothing to Kurt, no defense, but every slow, deliberate motion became a sharper answer than any outburst. No anger, no denial, no plea. And because of that, the crowd kept watching her longer. A woman who seemed to be a local journalist whispered to her companion, "She's letting them show all their own wrongdoing." Kurt started fumbling, unsure of what to do next. Footsteps slowed. The looks weren't confused anymore, they were suspicious. A man stepped behind Kurt and leaned into his friend's ear. "If this goes wrong, wrong, he loses everything. That comment wasn't meant for Kurt, but his heavier breathing, stiffer movements showed he was starting to feel it. No one spoke Joel's name aloud at that moment, but many had already typed in "Black Police Chief of this district" into their search bars, and when a few profile photos popped up, pictures from small articles, from her swearing in, from one with her beside the mayor, faces in the crowd began to shift. That moment, the market's silence gave way to a quiet kind of jolt, like the pavement underfoot had started to tremble. And while Kurt still believed he was rummaging through the anonymous bag of a black woman in the middle of the street, it was he, through every word, every kick, every sneer, who was exposing an entire system of discrimination that he embodied in real time. No one needed to accuse him. He performed the role of the villain flawlessly, and as the name Joel Ferris began to appear on every screen in the hands of the people around him, that system had already begun to crack. Right there, in the familiar market they once believed was safe. The second patrol car's siren let out a brief wail, then died into the crowd that had swelled around the market like silent waves. The car stopped at the curb, and a man stepped out. Tall and lean, short-striped haircut, a radio slung over one shoulder, hands in his pockets. The gray shirt he wore carried a lieutenant's badge, pinned crooked, as if to signal he wasn't the type to care about appearances. Jensen was the kind of cop who breathed out authority like stale air, and as his eyes scanned the scene, his mouth curled into half a bored smile. "What kind of suspect looks this good?" he said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for the hand-cuffed woman to hear. Joelle sat against the hood of Kurt's car, collar askew from being yanked, hair messy, but her spine still straight. She didn't look up right away, waiting until Jensen was directly in front of her before raising her head, eyes slowly searching the smugness behind his smile. When the smell of old smoke from his shirt reached her nose, Joelle spoke evenly. "I'm your superior." For a fraction of a second, Jensen froze, as if someone had just misread a comedy script, then let out a dry, easy laugh. He tilted his head toward Kurt, eyes narrowing with amusement. "Oh, now we're playing pretend? Superior?" That smile carried no subtle mockery, only the confidence of someone who thought he stood exactly where power lived and the rest of the world was his playground. Joelle didn't answer. Her gaze locked on one point of his face long enough to see his cheek muscles twitch as he tried to keep up the sneer. No one around them laughed. No one moved. It was as if everyone had been nailed to the ground, caught inside a performance with no safe end in sight. Kurt stepped closer, standing beside Jensen as if reinforcing the disdain. His voice dropped lower but stayed sharp. Probably learned some reverse psych trick somewhere, pretending to be the boss. "You people are clever, huh?" He looked Joelle up and down, eyes scanning for some crack in her calm that he could pry open. But Joelle didn't budge. Her shoulders stayed steady, her eyes fixed. She seemed to understand that every motion now could be twisted into something against her. And so, her stillness became the very thing that made the scene around them fall into its own raw truth. The mockery from the two officers, one who hit, one who smiled, was already becoming an image no one could unsee. Across the street, a group of 3 students stood huddled around a phone screen. One had just started a live stream, speaking in a low but firm voice. She just said she's their superior, police chief. Another asked, "How do we know it's true?" The one holding the phone answered quickly, "Look at how they're acting. If she were nobody, they wouldn't need to laugh like that." The logic was simple, but so clear, it left the others quiet. A soft murmur returned to the crowd, small at first, like the sound of water rising through cracks underground. Questions began surfacing in the minds of those watching. What if she's telling the truth? What if they're wrong? Why didn't they check her name before cuffing her? Jensen reached into his pocket, pulled out a peppermint, bit it in half, and spoke without looking at Joelle. "You people are getting slick, huh? Fake badge? Nailed the script? With skin that thick, maybe join the acting guild." He laughed again, but this time it was shorter, less certain. A man who seemed to run a vegetable stall stepped a little close, his voice slightly shaky. I've seen her on the news. About police reform?" The woman beside him nodded. "She gave a speech. I remember her voice. Jensen turned to look at them but didn't respond. The crowd was shifting. If earlier they had watched out of curiosity, now they stood in quiet suspicion, not of Joel, but of the two officers, laughing louder as the evidence grew clearer. Joel didn't speak again, but she scanned a few faces in the crowd. She saw a young mother covering her child's eyes, a man adjusting his camera angle, and a young person scrolling for information. Each held a different posture, but all were tilting toward doubt. No one stepped in to defend her, but the silence had started to mean something else. It was no longer indifference, but the moment just before someone says, "I know this is wrong." Kurt didn't step back. He glanced at Jensen, then growled at Joel. "You think making up that title will get you out of this? You think any of us believe you're in charge? I've seen every scam there is. People like you are always trying to climb your way up with your mouth, not with merit." The words didn't need proof to reveal contempt. They weren't about exposing lies. They were accusations cast at an entire skin color, an entire generation, a belief that justice could come from someone like Joel. Nearby, the young man, still live streaming, whispered like someone witnessing something real unraveling. "We're watching a person have their entire identity denied in public. No questioning, no checking, just because she said she had authority." He didn't know how many were watching, but every heart emoji and comment sliding up the screen was like a beat of warning. Someone clipped the moment. Jensen laughed, then overlaid Joel's voice. "I'm your superior." The video wasn't online yet, but its aftershock was already spreading among those standing close enough to feel it. Jensen saw the shift. He wasn't stupid. He knew the doubt was growing, but professional ego, the habit of believing he was more right than others, kept him anchored in a posture of mockery as self-defense. He turned to Kurt, gave his partner a light tap on the shoulder, and lowered his voice. "All right, wrap it up, call it in. If she's really impersonating, there's at least a fake record to match." He didn't speak loudly anymore. He knew every word now could be captured, but that realization came too late. Joelle slowly turned, the handcuffs making the motion awkward, but her gaze didn't waver. Jensen caught that look, and for a brief moment, he didn't smile, because it wasn't the look of a suspect, and it wasn't fear. It was the look of someone who had sat in a seat higher than his and might return to it. So, once the last layers of his pretense fell away, and in that moment, in the middle of the market, under sunlight, surrounded by a crowd no longer fully aligned with the law, Jensen's smile, the smile of a man who thought he understood the situation, began to dissolve, slowly, into an uneasy silence. A smile belonging to someone who didn't know, didn't want to know, and wasn't ready to be held accountable when the truth was called by its name. The space around the patrol car felt frozen, under a thin layer of doubt. People's eyes were still fixed on their phones, but the cameras no longer pointed at the chaos. They began focusing on smaller details, on Jensen's face, on Kurt's stare, on Joelle's hand slowly lifting, not resisting, not struggling, just a brief motion, asking for permission to do the only thing that might still resolve a situation spiraling beyond control. "I want to open my wallet," she said, her voice even and low, eyes still on Jensen. He let out a dry grunt, then smirked, resting a hand on his hip like a man standing guard rather than handling a threat. But what he said landed like a dull blade cutting through the air. "Careful. She's probably got a gun." Joelle didn't react to that comment. Her hand moved toward the inside pocket of her coat, every movement slow, as if even the one doubting her should be able to see that she carried nothing in her palm. All eyes turned to her fingers as they slipped into the chest pocket. In that moment, silence became the loudest sound. People nearby held their breath. A young woman raised a hand to her mouth without realizing, eyes unblinking. An older woman sat down on a plastic stool, gripping the handle of her cane. No one knew which side to stand on anymore, because what was happening had surpassed right and wrong. It had entered the realm of bias, power, and a truth too many feared they'd misjudged. Joelle pulled out an object from her pocket, a black leather wallet, worn but still glossy around the edges, the kind used often, carried every day, not left in a drawer. She opened it, didn't hold it up, but placed it directly into Jensen's hand, as if handing over something that should never have required proof. Inside, a badge was tucked neatly behind a plastic sleeve, the words embossed in silver on a dull metallic background. Police Chief, Urban Crime Unit. Jensen took it, looked down. Sunlight hit the badge at an angle that made the text stand out. 1 second. 2 seconds. He said nothing, then let out a laugh, short, broken, like a cough, but loud enough to cut through the scene. "Where'd you get this printed?" "Etsy?" he asked, as if convinced it was a clumsy joke from someone lacking creativity, but his hand gave him away. There was hesitation in it, like his own body was betraying his voice. Jensen handed the badge to Kurt. Kurt glanced at it, held it like a grocery card, eyes darting, then looked at Joel. For the first time, he didn't speak. No mockery, no insult, just a silence that landed with weight. An elderly man in a worn blue sweater, sitting near the lamp post by the fruit stand, who had been watching quietly without recording, stood up. He stepped forward 2 paces and said with a firm voice, like issuing testimony in a crowded courtroom, "She's real. She's your superior. I've met her." People around him turned immediately. A middle-aged woman asked, "Are you sure?" He answered, "Yes. 3 months ago, at the community meeting about disarming the high school, she sat right next to me. I even shook her hand." That statement hit like a hammer on glass. Every phone that had been recording lowered, then rose again, but this time no longer aimed at Joel. Every lens pointed toward Kurt and Jensen. Their faces no longer belonged to men in control. They were the faces of men being watched, second by second. A young man in the back whispered, "Now everything they do is wrong. They just punched their superior." A woman beside him added, "And mocked her, called her fake, ran their mouths in front of 100 people. Joelle still stood upright, hands cuffed, but her eyes were now locked on Jensen, waiting, not for herself, but for the crowd, for him to acknowledge it. Jensen turned to Kurt, hesitating as if about to speak, but Kurt still hadn't looked away from the badge. No one said a word, and it was that silence that made the crowd louder than ever, not with voices, but with a shared thought. They know they were wrong, but they're too afraid to admit it. A teenage girl in a denim jacket opened her phone, launched a live stream, and typed a caption, "Police punched a woman. Just found out she's the police chief." Within 10 minutes, more than 500 people were watching live. A comment popped up instantly. "This isn't just a personal assault anymore. This is how the system treats the wrong skin color." The words scrawled fast, but each one seemed to land squarely on what was left of the pride in the uniforms standing at the scene. Not far away, a man in glasses, looking like a civil servant, opened a browser and searched for the name Joel Ferris. The top result was an article from 3 weeks earlier, "New Police Chief Joel Ferris sworn in downtown." The photo showed her on stage, hand on the Constitution, standing beside the mayor. He turned his phone toward his tablet screen, letting others see. A woman walking by glanced once, then turned sharply, pulled out her phone and snapped a photo. "That's really her," she said. "There's no way that's someone else." Jensen stood frozen, trapped between ego and truth. In his eyes was something no one could quite touch, not fear, but the feeling of being publicly unmasked. Kurt, still holding the badge, no longer looked like the aggressor from moments ago. His hand trembled slightly, not from emotion but from realization, arriving faster than he could defend against. The crowd had stopped keeping its distance. They stepped in closer. Some began asking direct questions. A middle-aged man called out, "If she's your superior, why did you hit her? What exactly did she do wrong?" Jensen didn't respond, but Joel looked at the man and gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that the question was the center of it all. No one shouted for an apology, no one chanted a slogan, but the air had thickened like glass, freshly cracked by a fault line, and everyone knew that crack was going to spread. Joelle was still in handcuffs, but when Jensen stepped back, no one believed she was the one being restrained. The silence of the 2 officers, their unsteady gazes, their fading excuses, all of it had handed back to her a kind of authority no badge could fully define. And for everyone standing nearby, from the boy who had just seen police hit someone for the first time, to the old man who once shook her hand at a community meeting, each was now asking themselves, what happens when the truth is mocked, and the one holding it doesn't bow? They didn't yet have the answer, but they had begun to stand on the right side, not because she shouted louder, but because she stood firmer, and none of them wanted to be the last to realize it. The sun had not yet shifted past the market roof when a video, just 11 seconds long, began to spread like lightning across social platforms. No effects, no color correction, just a shaky pan, a slight blur in motion, but enough to capture something none of the videographers dared to describe out loud. In the footage, Joelle is pinned against a car hood, one side of her face smeared with blood, eyes fixed on the person who just struck her. In front of her stands Kurt, shouting something inaudible, then throwing a punch that lands precisely as it meets her cheek. The audio cuts out at that moment. The frame trembles, a strangled breath is heard, and then she turns her head, pulls something from her chest pocket, and holds it out while her hands are cuffed. A close-up, likely unintentional, catches the lettering on a leather badge. Police Chief, Urban Crime Unit. The second person to upload the clip was a journalism intern, present at the market to shoot a feature about local produce. He hadn't expected to film anything beyond a technical assignment, but once the video hit TikTok, captioned simply, "She said she's the police chief," he laughed. Then the badge came out, the view count began to spike. 1,000 views in 5 minutes, 5,000 in the next 10, and by noon the video had reached 200,000. No one was asking about the market anymore. Everyone was asking, what's going on? Comments flooded in like a breached dam. Some were skeptical. Fake? Staged? Others were stunned. A cop hit their own chief? Still others wrote bluntly, if this is real, it's not just abuse of power, it's systemic bias. The questions cut deep into the consciousness of a generation straddling doubt and reality. Is this true, fake, or just insane? No one was certain, but everyone was drawn into a story told in mere seconds of footage. Everything in the clip seemed calculated to spark debate. The blood left uncleaned, the unflinching gaze, the punch uncut, and the badge impossible to fake with acting. Just 30 minutes later, a Twitter account named @MikeRichards72, described as local news writer, advocate for fair policy, reposted the clip with a caption, "I shook her hand when she took office last month. She's real." Mike had coordinated Joelle's swearing-in ceremony at City Hall. He wasn't famous, but he was familiar enough to local officials and journalists that his words triggered a domino effect. Beneath his tweet, people began reposting photos from the ceremony, quoting Joelle's remarks about justice and accountability, adding the hashtag with her name, Joelle Ferris. The silence from the scene had become the loudest voice on social media. People were no longer asking who was at fault, they were asking how this could have happened. At the farmers market, network signals began to slow down. Many people didn't leave not because they wanted to see more, but because they knew they had become witnesses to a turning point. A teenager, live streaming, turned the camera to his own face and said, "If this is how they treat a police chief, then imagine what they do to an ordinary person." That question echoed through hundreds of comments, each one a cut into the already fragile trust in police protection. The original video was copied, re-uploaded across every platform with Spanish and French translations, and a few unofficial Vietnamese subtitles. In a college dorm, a group of law students were discussing that punch during a break. A white student said, "If this video didn't go viral, they could have erased every trace." His roommate replied, "No. The problem is, even with the video out there, that doesn't mean anyone will be punished. We've seen that before." That conversation was also filmed, becoming its own separate TikTok, captioned, "Does justice exist without a camera?" It became one of the fastest trending follow-up videos after the original. Joelle still hasn't spoken. In those 11 seconds, she didn't say a word. She didn't look at the camera. But her face, her eyes, the way she stood upright and held out the badge like she needed no one's approval, all of it made her the center of a story she didn't need to narrate. Those who once doubted her began revisiting her past statements. Her first speech as police chief, where she said, "I don't want people to see me as a black woman holding a high position. I want to be seen as someone willing to act, even when I know I'll be questioned." A journalist from the local paper reposted the video, quoted that line, and wrote, "It looks like what she feared has arrived sooner than expected." Reporters from news outlets started calling the police department to confirm the identity of the woman in the clip. The department's media office declined to comment, but leaked internal messages revealed authenticity of the clip needs verification, no statements for now. Several anonymous accounts claimed they'd received orders to wipe all content related to Joelle from the department's internal website, further fueling public outrage. In the middle of that information storm, the 11-sec video continued to be broken down frame by frame. A reaction video account dissected each frame to show the punch wasn't reflex, it was deliberate. Joelle didn't move toward the officer, she was pulled back, and Kurt's expression after the punch wasn't anger, it was satisfaction. That analysis went viral, followed by thousands. Some began illustrating the moment she held up the badge, turning it into artwork for a series on discrimination in law enforcement. Jensen, the man standing next to Joelle when she held out the badge, was caught from multiple angles. In each version, his eyes carried an unmistakable smirk. Every image was shared with a new caption: "The smile you make when you think you're winning, but forget to check the victim's ID." These images needed no further commentary. They spoke for themselves. And while every social platform was spinning in chaos over a moment more raw than many covered-up cases before it, Joelle still had not spoken. She hadn't appeared on television, hadn't issued an official statement, hadn't filed a legal response. Yet that absence only made her presence more vivid. With each passing hour, that silence echoed louder in the minds of those who once believed the system was meant to protect. That 11-second video didn't change the world, but it held a mirror up to it, clear and close. And in that mirror, people no longer saw a black woman being struck. They saw a system striking at its own identity, then flinching when caught. Joelle didn't need to say anything to make them afraid. They were afraid of themselves, realizing they had hit someone they weren't supposed to hit, and that everyone had seen it. No denials, no erasing, no pretending it didn't happen, because now it had all been captured inside 11 seconds. That's what no one could undo. As the 11-sec video reached classrooms, kitchens, train stations, and conference rooms, what lingered wasn't the punch, and not entirely the badge either. It was Joelle's eyes. Not pleading eyes, but a gaze hardened and steady, as if she had seen this happen to others more than once. And this time, it was happening to her. No soundtrack, no captions needed. Just that gaze alone was enough to ignite a wave across social media that no one could contain. An elementary school teacher in the suburbs posted a status with a photo of her daughter staring at a screen. She just watched the video and asked me, "Mom, what if it were you?" I looked at her and didn't know how to answer. Tens of thousands of shares followed in just 2 hours. Below, the comments wavered between outrage and helplessness. One person wrote, "I used to think the law would protect us. Turns out it only protects the ones who write it." Another said, "If a police chief can be treated like that in broad daylight, then no one is safe." The anger began spilling beyond personal reflections, creeping into the voices of people who had never spoken of justice before. At the same time, a second video clip leaked. It's unclear who recorded it, only that it was cut from the left side of the market square, where the camera caught Kurt clenching his fist and shouting, "You people will never be part of this team." His voice sliced through the crowd, every word clear, untouched by noise or technical glitch. Those words needed no interpretation. The entire internet instantly understood that he wasn't just speaking to Joelle, but to an entire group of people. Viewers no longer questioned whether it was a moment of rage or a worldview forged into reflex. And from that moment on, the anger was no longer confined to a single city. Social platforms exploded in unison. Short videos repeated the moment Joelle was punched, the moment she held up her badge, the moment Jensen smiled, the moment Kurt shouted, all overlaid with solemn music or slow drum beats. But amid the effects, what spread fastest was a phrase no one programmed: "Her silence is power." At first, it was just a comment. Then it became a hashtag. Then it turned into a slogan no one needed to launch. People tagged it under screenshots of Joelle's gaze, under posts retelling stories of being dismissed and not believed, under status updates describing the silence that follows when your dignity is denied in everyday life. Another variation appeared shortly after: "She is the chief. No explanation needed." The phrase accompanied a close-up of Joelle's badge, clipped from the now viral video. Those who once doubted her fell silent. Those who had kept their distance now shared the video as if it were a moral duty. No one gave orders, no one got paid. But every click, every share was an act of resistance they hadn't previously had the courage to voice. And while everyone else was speaking up, Joelle still had not made a statement. She wrote nothing, issued no release, posted no status. Yet everyone knew she was present in every post through the unshakable silence she held. A media studies scholar wrote in an online journal, "When the central figure doesn't speak, it forces others to fill the silence. And what they fill it with now is their own fear, the fear that they too have been silent like her, but never steady enough to make that silence a source of strength." That analysis spread widely in academic circles and quickly appeared in a student essay from California. They described Joelle as the first wordless icon of the post-George Floyd generation, not falling, not crying out, not leaving, but standing her ground, forcing others to step back. A black female musician composed a short piano piece based on a normal heartbeat rhythm, layering it with footage of Joelle standing still after the punch, and titled it "Steady Heartbeat, Steady Power." That wordless track became the soundtrack for hundreds of follow-up videos. People began posting images of relatives who had been humiliated, ignored, misnamed, and told, "You should know your place." Every sentence, every post, flowed like an underground current toward one point, a place where, for the first time, people saw a female police chief who didn't have to shout or argue, yet still forced an entire system into discomfort. Jensen has not spoken, Kurt even less. The local news station contacted the police department for confirmation and was refused a response. But the original clip had already been backed up by more than 30 accounts, including international pages. A channel in South Korea translated Kurt's shouted words and added subtitles, "You will never belong." That line spread across forums for gender equality and anti-discrimination, even in parts of Asia where few knew who Joelle was. But they understood the feeling of being excluded from the very society one lives in. And they chose to stand with her, not because of shared skin, but shared wounds. A state-level politician wrote briefly on their personal account, "If her silence makes you feel ashamed, the fault isn't hers." That tweet was quoted tens of thousands of times, each time paired with either a screenshot from the video or some symbol tied to law enforcement. Someone merged Joelle's eyes with images of those lost to abuse of power. Someone else wrote, "We used to make tribute videos for the dead. This time, we have to protect the living." She still hasn't said a word, but people are speaking for her. It's not a forced representation. It's the effect of someone who showed an entire society that sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the loudest form of accusation. And on that platform, every word from Kurt, every laugh from Jensen, every glance that turned away has been preserved, not for vengeance, but so no one forgets the moment when old power laughed out loud, while true dignity stood still at the center of the market, not bowing, not conceding, still waiting for those who struck in panic and couldn't admit they were wrong. The outrage had spread, but this outrage came without smashing or shouting. It was quiet, it was deep, and it showed no sign of stopping. Once the video had reached a level of circulation where almost everyone had seen it at least once, the reaction on social media was no longer simple support or outrage. It began to fracture into fragments of questions. People weren't just asking why she was hit or why the badge wasn't acknowledged. They started to scrutinize Joelle's silence throughout the entire sequence of events. A popular conservative account posted, "If she's legit, why didn't she speak up from the start? If she's the police chief, why not show the badge right away? Why wait to get hit before confirming her identity?" The question wasn't irrational, but it was framed with a kind of performative innocence, pretending that systems always work as as long as the victim speaks fast enough, loud enough, with the right credentials. Below the post were hundreds of replies. Some agreed, others pushed back. But what mattered was that it triggered a new wave of analysis, no longer aimed at the aggressors, but at the central figure, the one who endured it all, without a word. Another account compiled all available angles into a single 2-minute video. In it, every moment Joelle was shoved to the ground, pinned against the car, mocked by Jensen, searched by Kurt like a petty thief, was slowed down. These clips had no music, just breathing, the market's background noise, and the bark of shouted commands. But the focus was on her eyes. Each frame paused on how she looked at those in front of her. Not pleading, not afraid, not justifying. That video spread at astonishing speed. Viewers didn't need to know her name. They only had to see how she was treated, as if she had no name, no title, no human rights, to understand what had happened. Another user posted a short status alongside a still from the clip, captioned, "Maybe she didn't speak because she wanted to see what the system would do when it didn't know who she was." That line was shared by hundreds of public figures, not just activists, but also journalists, artists, and scholars. They began reframing the core question: what happens when a person of color, holding the highest authority in law enforcement, is still not believed simply because they didn't declare their identity immediately? And if someone must always state who they are to be treated decently, is that system truly fair? This question became the spark. No one was focused on the punch anymore. No one doubted the badge. What shook the city now was the realization that their social reflexes were being exposed. What if the person had been anonymous? What if it had been an office worker, a nurse, a homemaker, someone with no power? Then what? And if even those with power aren't exempt from bias, how long can any excuse for this behavior hold up? Newsrooms began opening public discussion sections. One homepage posted a poll with the headline, "If you were her, would you say you're the police chief?" Nearly 80% chose yes, to avoid being hit. The remaining 20% selected no, to see what they'd do if they thought I was just a regular person. In the comments, one person wrote, "I chose no, even knowing it would hurt, because I want to see what they really think of me when I'm not wearing a badge." It was that kind of thinking that gradually turned Joelle into a symbol, not because of her rank, but because she refused to take part in a survival negotiation that had become an unspoken rule. A documentary filmmaker stitched together the insults from Kurt, the laughter from Jensen, and various shots showing the crowd's apathy or suspicion, then added a single voiceover. If she had spoken up, would they have believed her, or would they have said, "Prove it"? That question left viewers in silence, because at the moment Joelle pulled out her badge, no one believed her right away. People laughed. Some doubted. One even tried to tear it apart. That revealed a painful truth. It wasn't that people didn't know who she was. It was that they didn't want to believe it. Joelle's silence was no longer a tactic. It became a reflection of everyone who had lived within this system. People began sharing their own stories, being misnamed, asked where they were going, told to show ID for no reason. Each story connected to a long thread stretching across time and social class. Not everyone had been struck, but nearly everyone had faced the burden of proving they deserved respect. And Joelle, by staying silent, made them remember that feeling, the first time they weren't believed, even though they had done nothing wrong. Debate forums started to fill with long posts about the right to be believed, a concept that once seemed abstract but now felt essential. A white attorney wrote, "I used to think it was enough just not to be prejudiced, but now I see that staying silent when others are doubted is also a form of denying their dignity." An Asian American doctor posted, "I was questioned 5 times at the airport about why I was entering the country, even though I'm a U.S. citizen and wore a lab coat. When I pushed back, they said, 'If you're really a doctor, stay calm.'" Each piece of the story spread like smoke, seeping into layers of awareness. What horrified people wasn't Kurt's punch. It was the enormous gap between being a regular person and having the right to be treated like a human being. That gap remained until Joelle pulled out the badge, and that act, instead of calming the situation, exposed every fracture in the way society assumes who gets to be heard and who must always prove they belong. The entire city could no longer look away. Those who had once scrolled past the video now stopped to watch it a second time. Those who had stayed silent were now writing posts, sharing and responding. Television reports no longer ask, "Is this real?" but instead, "What does this mean?" That was the biggest shift, from doubt to reckoning, and in that shift, Joelle never had to appear again. Her absence was what forced everyone to confront themselves, a hard conversation, but one they could no longer avoid. No one called her by her title anymore. They used her first name, not to diminish her, but to recognize she is a person, first and foremost, and if someone like her had to endure that much just to be believed, how much more must those without a badge endure just to be called by their rightful name? In that question, the city fell silent for the first time. But this time, the silence was to listen, not to Joelle, to themselves. Because if they kept pretending not to see, they would lose the right to ask why this keeps happening. The photo appeared online on Wednesday morning, just 2 days after the Punch video had gone viral. No TV backdrop, no reporters, no spotlight, just a wide frame capturing Central Park with Joelle standing on the grass, fading into late autumn. The light angled gently, highlighting the dark circle under her left eye, where the bruise had not fully healed. She wore a mouse-gray coat, the high collar nearly covering her chin, arms relaxed at her sides, not crossed, not tucked in pocket. The photographer didn't come close, but the angle was enough to catch her eye. Looking straight ahead, unusually calm, as if the entire city were moving around her but couldn't touch the core of what she carried. The photo was taken accidentally by a high school student walking through the park during lunch. He didn't know who she was until he got home and his mother turned on the news and asked, "Did you see this woman today?" When he confirmed, he just nodded and said she was standing there, not doing anything, but everything felt different. The caption below the photo was simple: "I'm still here." No drama, no emphasis, no added context. Those 4 words spread across platforms within 6 hours. No one launched a campaign, but the photo was shared thousands of times, each share paired with a personal story. Someone wrote, "I left this city because I was tired of the way people looked at me. Now I'm back." Another wrote, "She's there, not hiding, not explaining, just standing." Those who had followed the story from the start saw the image and realized, for the first time, it wasn't a video clip, not the punch, not the badge, but her whole and present self that made everything feel permanently changed. Mainstream outlets began using the photo as the headline image, but no one added a dramatic tagline. They used the original caption as a message beyond the incident: "I'm still here." People printed it and taped it to streetlights, coffee shop windows, even on the covers of school notebooks at a few high schools. Activists didn't need massive protests. They just held printed copies and sat in long lines on the City Hall step. A group of design students turned the phrase into its own font and released it for free so anyone could download it and print it on anything. And in another city, thousands of kilometers away, an elementary school class used that photo as the starting point for a writing assignment. Write about someone who stayed standing when others tried to push them away. No one made the kids understand the full story, but most of them came to the same conclusion: "I think she's a kind person." Joelle posted nothing further. She never confirmed she had been in the park that day, but the entire city knew, or believed it knew, she had been there, and that belief was enough to create an image no law or title could ever bestow. Because in the end, what people respected wasn't that she had once been the police chief. It was that she didn't leave, even when anyone would have had every reason to walk away. She didn't speak. She didn't take a podium. She didn't preach about dignity, but by standing in the park with a bruised cheek and steady gaze, she made the entire city ask itself, if I were treated like that in public, would I dare return to that place and simply stand? And because of that question, they couldn't look away anymore. Not out of duty, but because they knew that in the moment the one who was struck came back, the witnesses could no longer pretend to forget. Her name began appearing in the headlines in a more formal font than usual. no longer the victim of a farmer's market altercation, no longer a black woman assaulted by police in broad daylight, but a clear, resolved title: Joelle Ferris, 39, first police chief of Eastwood District. News outlets, both local and national, used her real name, real title, and real face as a leading image. Those who once doubted began digging through old records, finding her inauguration speech, a short video of her speaking with the mayor, and a photo of her in uniform holding the Reform Charter. No one rewrote the past, only now people began reading what they had once ignored. Her name was not only in the news, but also echoed in city council meetings, in letters to editors, and in hundreds of community podcasts discussing justice. Radio stations read out her professional history, emphasizing the number of internal investigations she had successfully led, the civil complaint reform she had been the first to push forward. Analysts stressed that she was not some nameless figure elevated onto a moral pedestal. She was real, with a real position, someone who had once protected the same system that, in a decisive moment, turned its back on her. And like a response that needed no prompting, people began to gather at the central square. They brought no speakers, no flags. Each person stood just an arm's length apart, holding a square sign, black text on white background, with the bold words, "If she didn't speak, who will?" No one added anything. No one chanted. Each person stood still, eyes forward, not toward the cameras, but toward the invisible wall that had long divided belief from the right to be believed. There were students, nurses, teachers, factory workers, and retirees. A few wore police uniforms, standing in the line, badges visible with no explanation. A young boy stood next to his mother, the sign too big for his hands, but he held it straight, eyes locked in focus, trying not to blink. The earliest reporters on the scene all realized the same thing. This wasn't a protest. This was a quiet, collective challenge. No one shouted, no one cried, but the silence was so dense that even footsteps seemed swallowed by the pavement. The signs bearing the question weren't aimed at anyone in particular, but anyone who read them had to stop. Because the question wasn't about Joelle, it was about the reader. If she hadn't spoken, and if society needs someone to be punched to be believed, do we still have the right to ask others to be brave? If she said nothing and people still heard her, then who's the next person that must speak before being silenced by force? When the first photo from the square began circulating, other places followed. A small group in Seattle stood in front of police headquarters, each holding a sign. A group of students in Georgia held a forum, opening with that same question posted on the lecture board. Churches began quoting the line in weekend sermons, not for political reasons, but because the words struck at the root of a moral culture that often avoids naming what feels inconvenient. Joelle wasn't at the square that day, but everyone felt she had once stood there. She didn't need to step up to a podium, didn't need to thank the support. And because she wasn't there, the question on the sign hit even harder. No verbal answer was needed. It just had to follow people home, stay in their thoughts long enough, until silence no longer felt like the safe choice. Because this time, when she didn't speak, they understood. And they knew that if they let themselves stay quiet, someday their own names would be the ones printed on other signs, where no one would be left willing to stand in the crowd, just to remind them not to pretend they forgot. That afternoon, an independent news channel released a 4-minute video stitched together from 3 different angles with no scene cuts, no commentary, no background music, and no explanatory subtitles. It began with the moment Kurt stepped out of the patrol car, walking angrily, the camera shaking slightly but still clear enough to catch the way his eyes scanned each person as if deciding who needed to be pushed aside. When he shouted into the air and no one responded, the camera turned to Joelle, standing in line for apples, then captured her gaze, calm but direct, as she turned and answered him with one short sentence. That line wasn't repeated in the clip, but viewers already knew it by heart. "This is a public walkway." And from there, everything that followed played out like a cross-section, exposing the structure of a system, powered more by habit than by reason. Without music to guide emotion, the viewer was forced into pure confrontation with reality. The punch came suddenly, without warning, blood spreading from the edge of her mouth into a slow red streak on her shirt. Joelle staggered right, but stood up with just one planted foot and a shoulder pushing back. No words, no resistance. The close-up scenes shifted from her hands pinned behind her face cast in shadow by someone standing over her, to the moment Kurt began rummaging through her pockets, tossing items like he was tearing through the dignity of someone he didn't need to name. Each movement was slowed just enough to show the brutality, but not long enough for viewers to look away. The moment Joelle asked for permission to open her wallet felt like a challenge to everyone watching. Are people ready to witness someone having to ask before proving the legitimacy of their own existence? Jensen approached, and the line, "Careful, this bitch might have a gun," slipped into the microphone of a phone recording from afar. Though the audio quality was poor, no one could deny the intent behind the words. When Joelle handed over the badge, placing it in Jensen's palm, the police chief logo appeared so clearly that every scratch on the leather case was illuminated by sunlight. Silence stretched for several beats before Jensen laughed and asked where the badge had been printed. Viewers weren't asked to judge, but each frame passed its own verdict. The final moment of the clip showed the elderly man selling oranges standing up, his voice sharp as he said he had met her at a community meeting. When he finished speaking, the crowd stirred, and the camera no longer followed the main subject. It began to pan across the faces of those standing nearby. Some covered their mouths, some dropped their eyes, and some turned their phones toward Jensen and Kurt's expressions. That moment needed no narration, because every glance was a small courtroom. No one shouted, but no one walked away from the scene either. That was the moment when truth filled the entire screen. The 4-minute video contained no commentary, but every second peeled back a layer from what had once been seen as random. Viewers didn't see a single act of violence. They saw a chain of consequences allowed to exist because, too many times, people had looked away. When the television network aired the clip during the evening news, they didn't insert commercial breaks. The entire segment ran uninterrupted, guided only by a white line of text on a black screen. The full event, nothing more, nothing less. Reactions came instantly. Tens of thousands of messages poured in. Many wrote, "I had heard about this, but I didn't truly understand until I watched the full 4 minutes." Another viewer said, "I don't think I can look my daughter in the eyes tonight and say nothing." Precisely because the video had no effects, no dramatization, no effort to engineer emotion, it couldn't be brushed aside as a random incident. People couldn't pretend they hadn't seen it. They couldn't say, "I need more data." Those 4 minutes were all the data society needed to answer the question Joelle never asked, but everyone was forced to consider. If I were someone without a badge, would I still be alive to say this? That's why the screen couldn't be cut, because removing even a single frame would erase part of the truth that people have long claimed they lacked enough evidence to believe. Now it was there, frame by frame, eye by eye, judgment by judgment, without a single word, and that made it more haunting than any newscast before. A veteran journalist from the morning paper, after watching the full 4-minute video, wrote a single sentence in the editorial column, "This is a case with no blood, but full of social wounds." The quote was printed in bold on the front page of the early edition the next morning. No elaborate analysis, no sensational headline. Because after the flood of images that had filled the media landscape, readers were no longer searching for answers about who was right or wrong. They were searching for a way to name the sting they felt, watching a human being treated like a shadow, struck like an object, and then forced to produce proof of their worth in silence. The journalist didn't write about Kurt, Joelle, or the badge. He wrote about a society that saw clearly what was broken and still kept its distance under the guise of neutrality. And that wound, not one that bleeds, but one that bruises the collective conscience, will take a long time to heal. That same evening, the state television network, known until then for its cautious approach to reporting on racial issues, unexpectedly aired the entire video during its main broadcast at 7 p.m. prime time, with no introduction, no effects, and no commercial break. The screen shifted from the regular news segment to a black background, then slowly revealed the title, Unedited Footage, 4 minutes. What followed matched the original exactly. The harsh morning light at the market, The background chatter and shouting, then the punch, then silence, then the worn leather badge in a hand, then the elderly man speaking, and finally Joelle bending to pick up her belongings, one by one, in silence, under hundreds of watching eyes. No explanation was given for why the clip was aired in full. The anchor didn't return to the screen after it played. The broadcast ended on a black screen with a single, small, white line of text. Source, captured by the community. In that moment, no one called for action, but many people set their phones down and sat in stillness, not to feel sympathy, but to confront. Those who had previously ignored the news began searching for the clip across platforms, watching again, sharing not for attention, but because they knew they had to see it for themselves. It was the silence of the station, the fact that no one stepped in to explain, that made the video louder than any political commentary ever had. People no longer needed guidance. They understood what they were witnessing. And when that journalist wrote about a case without blood, he wasn't wrong. The blood had dried, but the wounds remained sharp in the awareness of a city that had just been forced to see itself again on the screen, uncut, unedited, undeniable. Immediately after the unedited 4-minute video was aired without introduction or cuts, public pressure on the police department was no longer about optics. It became a legal question about the legitimacy of every action carried out in front of hundreds of witnesses. In less than 24 hours, the spokesperson for the Internal Administrative Division issued a statement. A formal investigation would begin under the charge of unauthorized use of authority applied to both Kurt Halley and Lieutenant Jensen. Although the statement didn't mention Joelle by name, everyone understood this was no longer a personal matter. The incident had entered a new phase, one where the system had to examine itself in order to salvage what little integrity it had left. An independent internal review team was assembled immediately, and for the first time in decades, interrogations were not held behind closed doors but were overseen by a third-party group chosen from the civilian community. Each question went beyond Kurt's physical actions and dug into the decision not to verify the victim's identity, the mockery, and the fact that neither officer intervened in a moment as critical as that. People were no longer asking just why Joelle was struck. They were asking why the system allowed it to happen without anyone stopping it. Among the first to speak out, no one was mentioned more than a middle-aged white attorney named Charles Benton, who had previously won several civil rights cases and announced he would represent Joelle pro bono, not at her request, but as he described, out of moral duty. At the first press conference, when asked why, he spoke slowly, "I didn't take this case because she's the police chief. I took it because she's a living witness to a systemic crime." That line silenced the entire room. He didn't use the words abuse, bias, or accident. He named it plainly, systemic, and that was the key point that shifted the investigation beyond the two individual officers and into the processes of recruitment, behavioral oversight, training, and the ignored feedback from citizens who had filed complaints but never received a reply. Benton brought with him a file over 60 pages thick, including civil suits related to coercion, discrimination, and unnecessary force, tied to Kurt over the past 10 years. In 3 notable cases, the complainants were all black women who had filed statements that eventually disappeared due to a lack of evidence, or were dismissed as overreactions in chaotic situations. The striking pattern was that each of those reports had been closed by Jensen himself, signing off with the conclusion of no procedural violation. That revelation shifted public doubt from individuals to the very structure that allowed law enforcers to shield each other. Journalists dug deeper and uncovered internal review documents where multiple assessment notes had been crossed out and replaced with the phrase "acted within department standards." When those records were made public, the outrage didn't stem from shock. It came because everything now had form, had words, had signatures. On social media, a new hashtag began trending. "This wasn't the first punch," accompanied by images of documents long buried in internal records. People who had once been provoked, insulted, or dismissed when filing complaints began to speak out. One woman wrote, "I once reported Kurt for stopping my car in the middle of the street just to ask what neighborhood I lived in. When I asked him why, he laughed and said, 'Doesn't seem like you're from around here.'" Her post was shared over 100,000 times in 2 days. Another person described being forced to show proof of residence, despite having her child with her and all documents in hand. These stories were no longer rumors, because now there was the Joel incident as a reference point, making every personal account a credible piece of a much larger picture. At this stage, the internal investigation was no longer an administrative obligation. It had become an ethical test for the entire institution, or how the system handles truth when denial is no longer possible. And for the first time, the conversation shifted away from the victim's identity. People talked about the mechanism. They asked, who ignored the red flags for so long? Who signed off on no misconduct when the files showed otherwise? Who allowed someone like Kurt to keep wearing the uniform and walk the streets with an authority in hand? These questions weren't aimed at any one person, which made them even more powerful, forcing every supervisor within the police structure to take notice. No one stood outside it now. No one could say they didn't know. And that was when a single investigation began to shake the foundation of a system once thought solid as stone. As the investigation dug deeper into archived files, a truth emerged, clearer and colder than any justification the officers involved could offer. Kurt Halley had been sued 3 times over the past 8 years for excessive use of force and making racially charged remarks while on duty. In all 3 cases, full complaints had been filed, witnesses were present, and in 2 of them there was store camera footage near the scene. Yet somehow, each case ended with the same familiar conclusion, or acted under chaotic conditions, no violation of professional conduct. The deeper people read, the clearer they saw a recurring pattern, a response model where misconduct was diluted by soft legal language, and every doubt vanished beneath stamped signatures that read, "Case closed." This information didn't come from the press, but from the investigation overseen by the community. A group of volunteers, including young attorneys, data specialists, and former officials, had requested access to administrative records under public disclosure laws and found reports filed under the category Internal No Response Needed. They published their findings on an open data portal, complete with timestamps, document excerpts, and verified signatures. In one small chart was a line that read, Officer Kurt Halley, 3 lawsuits, 0 suspensions, 0 public accountability. That number became a cold emblem for something the public had long suspected, but never seen laid out so plainly. Immediately after the data chart began to circulate, bigger questions emerged, ones that reached beyond the personal. The first posts called out the Internal Recruitment Oversight Board by name, tracing who had been responsible for evaluating professional ethics each year. A legal forum stated clearly, no one walks away from 3 lawsuits with the same behavioral pattern unless someone is willing to sign off with their eyes closed. From that point, public scrutiny shifted from Kurt's actions alone to the machinery that had allowed his continued presence in the force for so long. Comments turned into direct challenges. Who approved his record so he could keep wearing the uniform? Who read the reports and said, "Looks good"? Who ignored the video evidence? These were no longer shouts into a void. This was direct pressure demanding that leadership step forward and explain. With every unanswered question, more surfaced. Faded reports, unsigned replies, decisions buried by time. The structure that had protected someone like Kurt for so long was no longer abstract. It had paperwork, signatures, timestamps, and names attached. And in that thick atmosphere of public anger, people stopped saying the system failed. They began naming the links in that system. They wanted to know who had opened the door for someone accused 3 times to remain in a role meant for those who protect. And when that question echoed across social media, news coverage, and city council meetings, silence was no longer a political strategy. It became a mark of complicity. And this time, the public didn't wait long for answers, because in this case, it was the public itself that had taken the lead in the real investigation. The evidence came from the least expected place. An ATM camera near the intersection of two entrances to the farmers market, originally installed to monitor financial transactions, had unintentionally captured the full path of the patrol car driven by Kurt. When investigators reviewed the footage based on initial testimony, they discovered the vehicle hadn't driven straight to the scene as the report claimed. It had circled the market 3 times in just 11 minutes. The clip had no sound, but the movements were clear. The car slowed near each group of black individuals, paused for several seconds, turned, returned from another direction, paused again, and only then approached the fruit stand where Joelle was standing. The slanted angles, early morning light, and reflections of figures passing across the windshield revealed a truth absent from any official report. Kurt hadn't stumbled upon the situation, he had gone looking for it. When the footage was presented before the independent review board, no explanation was needed. Delegates sat silent for over a minute after the screen went dark. One person asked, what would he have done if she weren't anybody? No one answered because the question wasn't meant to be solved, it was meant to confirm. The behavior hadn't come from a momentary loss of control, but from a selective intent, with the familiar denominator of skin color and the calmness of the person targeted. One investigator remarked afterward, "It's like watching someone stalk the system for a flaw just to justify exercising power." In a private interrogation, Jensen was forced to answer why he didn't intervene. Under pressure from the press and community representatives, the confidence in his confidence began to show cracks. When asked, "Did you doubt her position?" Jensen replied quickly, "I didn't believe her." An investigator followed up, "Why not?" Jensen hesitated, then answered as if searching for the right words and failing, "Because she didn't look like it." The room fell still. No one rushed to speak. A lawyer jotted the phrase down and repeated it. "You said she didn't look like it." "Look like what?" Jensen went silent. He didn't speak again, but the words he had already uttered were the clearest admission yet that his judgment was not based on protocol, not on background, but on a mental image, a filter that excluded anyone who didn't match his default idea of power. That interrogation clip leaked just a week later and spread rapidly. This time, the public didn't respond with fury, but with a cold recognition. They had heard this before. Many had lived it. Some accounts shared the clip with captions like, "I didn't look like a college student, so I had to show ID every day." Another wrote, "I didn't look like the owner, so they kept asking who my boss was." These stories multiplied, forming a living archive of how bias moves quietly through glances, tone, and reflex. And this time it was no longer subjective. It had Jensen's words as anchor, the ATM footage as proof, and Joelle's case as its undeniable point of impact. Sociologists analyze the phrase, "she didn't look like it," is an unconscious summary of something society has allowed to exist for far too long. The belief that people can instinctively tell who is worthy of trust and who isn't. Multiple forums were held to discuss visual bias in law enforcement. Police training instructors were ordered to review their materials, change how suspect descriptions were worded, and remove examples that automatically cast white individuals as victims and people of color as threats. Other cities used the case as precedent to launch internal investigations, reviewing how many officers had been reported for racial profiling but never held accountable. Joelle did not participate in any of these forums during this period, yet the same questions kept circling around her silent presence. If it hadn't been Joelle that day, if it had been someone without a title, would the system have ever looked back? And if there had been no ATM video, if Jensen hadn't blurted out his true thoughts, would anyone have had reason to believe this wasn't random? Through these ongoing questions, one truth became clear. The truth never comes from a single angle, a single account, or a single piece of evidence. It only reveals itself when enough fragments are put together to form a picture too big for personal excuses to hide. And in that moment, what frightened people most wasn't the wrongdoing, it was the realization that they had always known and chosen not to admit it. Jensen's interrogation, which seemed like a minor piece of an individual investigation, had cracked open something far wider than expected. When his entire description of Joelle came down to the phrase, "she didn't look like it," the review board didn't just react with surprise. Charles Benton, Joelle's attorney, leaned forward on the table, repeated the words verbatim, then looked Jensen in the eye. Didn't look like what? The question echoed through the airtight room, where no one dared clear their throat, but Jensen said nothing. He lowered his head, hands clenched, eyes darting across the wall as if searching for a crack to escape the tightening grip around his throat. Not a word came out, but that silence in that moment was the clearest confession. He didn't stay quiet because he lacked words. He stayed quiet because he knew that anything he said would confirm everything this system had long been silently built to do. After the hearing, the transcript was submitted to the district court for review. Less than 2 days later, a state judge issued an order to expand the investigation across the entire unit where Kurt and Jensen served. No longer limited to isolated behavior, the inquiry moved vertically, examining recruitment processes, ethical review records, complaint handling procedures, and internal disciplinary mechanisms. Every document, once dismissed as insufficient for opening a file, was retrieved, cross-hectored with personnel data, patrol reports, and even dashboard camera footage. Shift logs with overlapping hours, incident reports built from copied templates, and anomalies in use of force frequency were all brought forward, placed under a lens guided by long-standing questions. Who picked whom? Who cleared the path? And why were those at fault still promoted? The public didn't just watch, they took part, reopening old cases once buried. Those who had filed complaints only to be turned away for procedural reasons began resubmitting their documentation through the State Justice Board's open channels. A middle-aged woman wrote in her letter, "I reported an unlawful car search 5 years ago. The officer was Kurt Halley. They told me I had no evidence. Now the evidence has spoken for me." Each resubmitted file struck a blow at a foundation thick with dust. And this time, unlike before, the system no longer had the privilege of dismissing cases quietly. Every delayed decision, every vague rejection letter now risked being exposed, dissected, and questioned, not only by victims, but by the public at large. Meanwhile, journalists began reopening past investigations, stories once shelved for lack of verifiable data. One news channel revealed they had received allegations about Kurt 4 years earlier, but withheld broadcasting after police threatened legal action for defamation. Producers disclosed that they had kept all email correspondence with the department. Once released, the emails showed a quiet, pressure model where control over information was maintained by planting fear, using phrases like, "Please consider the legal consequences of misrepresenting an active duty officer." All of it converged on a single truth. The system believed it could survive by covering up one small detail at a time, never anticipating that those very details, when added together, would form the most complete portrait. And it was Jensen's silence, his wordless shake of the head, that became the emblem of the moment. Everything could no longer be hidden. When a state judge called for a full unit investigation, it wasn't a sentence handed down to Kurt or Jensen alone. It was the final confirmation that what had come to light didn't originate from a single wrongdoer, but from a structure long practiced in the logic of exclusion. And this time, the truth didn't need to be shouted to be heard. It only needed to be placed in the hands of someone willing to look straight at it and say, "Enough." In the solemn atmosphere of the district's main courtroom, Joelle Ferris sat across from the very people who had once questioned her identity, used their authority to dismiss her worth, and were now forced to face consequences through the specific terms of the law. There was no flashy legal team, no lawsuit demanding damages, no statements seeking compensation for emotional or financial harm. When asked what she wanted from the case, she gave a simple reply: "I want a public admission of wrongdoing." That sentence echoed through the wide courtroom, lined with long benches, filled with press, the public, and members of the city council. It didn't carry a tone of forgiveness or leniency. It was a direct demand, requiring the system to acknowledge a failure that couldn't be pinned on any one person, but had to be recognized at its root. The case was tried before a jury of 12, most of whom were white, from middle-class neighborhoods and with higher education backgrounds. From the outset, observers worried the imbalance in representation might sway the outcome, especially in light of a history where similar cases often ended without anyone held accountable. But the unedited 4-minute video was played in full during the first day of testimony. No music, no cuts, just original footage and sound, and that stopped every prediction cold. As the images filled the large courtroom screen, no one looked away. From the jury box, a few leaned on their hands. One removed their glasses, wiped them quickly, then put them back on. No one spoke, but everyone understood. This time, flowery language wouldn't soften what had been made too clear. Joelle did not rise to accuse anyone in anger, nor did she seek pity. Her testimony was brief, focused, and each sentence cut through the layers of systemic excuses. She described how she was shoved into the car, how Jensen's gaze didn't see her as a woman, nor a superior, but as an imposter. She recalled being obstructed in her role, despite being the head of her department, meetings where her input was cut short, and the glances she received while walking down hallway. Her words didn't dramatize the incident. They simply gave it context, making it impossible for listeners to separate the punch from everything that came before. It wasn't an isolated outburst, but the final result of what had been ignored for far too long. Joelle's attorney, Charles Benton, during his closing argument, did not present a damage figure, did not mention Joelle's image in the media, and did not use the term racism outright. He looked directly at the jury and said, "We are not here to judge a punch. We are here to judge what made that punch permissible." That sentence became the anchor point of the entire trial. It forced each juror to turn inward, not just to weigh the defendant's guilt, but to consider what they had believed, what they had overlooked, and why. In the final debate, the defense could not deny the video, could not refute Jensen's admission, and could not offer any credible reason for failing to verify the identity of a police chief in the middle of a public market. Their only argument was that Kurt's actions were lacking judgment under pressure. In truth, the jury came back with everyone but Jensen failing. Only Augerth wins. But that was immediately undercut by the evidence that he had circled the area multiple times beforehand, as if choosing a target. After 3 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered on Monday morning. Officer Kurt Halley was permanently removed from duty, stripped of all badges and retirement benefits. Jensen was demoted and required to undergo special retraining conducted by an outside agency. The entire case was entered into public record, unsealed, as a standing precedent, so that future cases could not claim lack of precedent. No one cheered in the courtroom. No one wept, but as Joelle stepped down from the witness stand and walked the aisle between 2 rows of wooden benches, people quietly rose, not clapping, not calling her name, only nodding in acknowledgement, as if to say, she was no longer just the central figure of a specific incident. She was the one who had forced the system to finally speak the truth that everyone had known, but no one had dared to write down. And this time, it had been written, clearly, decisively, with no need to say her name again. Charles Benton's closing line echoed not just as an argument, but as a moral indictment that made the entire room confront itself. When he stood, walking slowly to the center of the floor, without a slideshow, without placing his hand on the lectern, he spoke in the steady, worn voice of someone who had tried many cases. "We are not here to judge a punch. We are here to judge what made that punch permissible." The sentence landed like a final period to every excuse about circumstances, job stress, instinctive reaction, or confusion of roles. Because in the painfully clear framing of that 4-minute video, there was no space left for ambiguity. No one in that room could rely on maybe or what if anymore. The trial had moved beyond the boundaries of one isolated act to become a reckoning for permissiveness, for every time someone looked away, for the entire system built to let someone like Kurt exist, rise, and keep power without ever being challenged. The jury, after 3 days of deliberation, without releasing any interim remarks, emerged from the closed room on a cloudy morning. When the judge began reading the verdict, the large courtroom fell completely silent. No coughs, no scraping chairs, no camera clicks or recording beeps. Even though the press was fully present, the words rang out clearly, each beat like it was struck onto wood. The court rules: permanent termination for Officer Kurt Halley. All badges, system access, and retirement benefits revoked. He is barred from reinstatement or re-entry into any law enforcement agency within the state. The verdict was recorded as a public document, unsealed, fully open to media access. It wasn't a punishment meant to appease public outrage, but a symbolic act, one that marked the first sign of recovery from within a structure long accustomed to shielding its own. Jensen, the officer who had stood with Kurt at the scene and laughed when Joelle held out her badge, received a demotion without compensation, along with a mandatory 6-month ethics training program overseen by an independent civilian counsel. He said nothing as the sentence was read. No protest, no appeal, just a slight bow of the head that he held for the rest of the session. Some in the courtroom saw it as remorse, but many believed it was simply the last reflex of someone who had once believed he'd never be touched. As for Joelle, she sat between her 2 legal representatives, eyes fixed on the bench as the judgment was delivered. No reaction, no nod, no tears. Her expression was the same as when she stood in the park with the bruise still fresh on her cheek, calm but unmoving. When the trial ended, she stood up without needing support or cover. No one approached to take a photo, and no one tried to pull her aside for comment. She walked out like any ordinary perso, wrapping up a personal task, leaving behind no spectacle, only a silence that made others reflect on themselves as they rose from their seats. That same day, major news outlets published editorials bearing eerily similar headlines, as if all had been shaped by Benton's statement, "We're not judging a punch." That line became the entry point for a flood of analysis into police training, oversight, accountability, and privilege. The case began to be referred to as the system's trial, not just for what happened, but for how it forced everyone to redefine what justice really means. A punch can be forgotten, a ruling can be overturned, but what allows those things to keep happening without being stopped? This time, it was brought to the table, documented, and turned into a lesson everyone could see. No names needed repeating, because this time what mattered wasn't the name of the one who was hit, but the names of those who would no longer dare to do it again. Not long after the trial concluded, Joelle Ferris received an invitation from the State Police Academy, once a top institution in officer training, but also a place where many course materials had yet to reflect the realities outside its gates. The invitation wasn't to honor her as a symbol, but because they needed someone who had lived both roles, a high-ranking commander and a person subdued in broad daylight, someone who understood the theory of power and had stood beneath fist of abuse. She accepted, not for reputation, but because she knew her presence was needed where the hardest questions were often avoided. In her first class, without a long introduction or a list of accomplishments, she simply stood at the lectern, looked down at the silent rows of seats, and asked in a steady voice, not loud, not soft, but enough to be heard by every ear, "How many of you have ever thought skin color determines threat level?" The question dropped into the room like a stone thrown into still water. No hands went up. A few shifted in their seats, a few eyes glanced sideways, and some pens stopped moving. There was no answer, but that silence was the most honest response she could ask for. She didn't demand admissions or turn the session into an interrogation. Instead, she told her story in an even tone, like recounting a past shift. She spoke of having her own bag searched by a colleague who'd never greeted her in the hallway, of a punch aimed not just at her body, but at erasing the position she'd earned after 20 years of service. She spoke of standing in a crowd, forced to choose between resisting or observing, between speaking out or letting the system indict itself. Every detail wasn't meant to evoke emotion, but to place the student face to face with the bias they carried beneath their uniform. Joelle used no abstractions, no moral lectures. She had the class analyze real-world incidents from news reports and court rulings, including her own case, under the title Scenario Simulation Use of Authority. The students weren't told the case was hers. They were asked to assess it, discuss how it was handled, identify violations, and propose solutions. Only after the final presentations did she return to the screen and reveal the line. Victim's name, Joelle Ferris. Position at the time, police chief. The room froze. A young student near the door set down his pen and looked up, stunned. Another murmured, "I thought it was just a regular person." She nodded and replied immediately, "I am a regular person. My title didn't protect me from bias. The question is, do you want to be the kind of officer who forces someone to prove they deserve to be treated decently?" A few weeks later, the class became one of the highest-rated courses at the academy, not because of a new syllabus, but because for the first time, students had to face the discomfort of being unable to dodge a moral question. Joelle didn't teach them how to avoid trouble. He taught them how to examine themselves before deciding to issue commands to others. She often ended class with an open question. When you meet a stranger on the street, what's your first instinct? Look for fault or look to understand? That question followed students out of the classroom, back to their barracks, and into every field shift. A few wrote it in their notebooks. This job means choosing to be human before choosing to be a cop. Joelle didn't impose a new philosophy. She simply cleared the space for others to ask themselves, in the moment of action, would they have the strength to hold on to their humanity before defaulting to the authority they were taught to wield? And when class ended, no one rushed out. They walked slowly, as if understanding that somewhere in those steps away from their seat, there would come a moment when they'd face a decision no textbook had prepared them for. In that moment, the only lesson that might remain would be the sound of her calm voice, cutting straight into the heart. What do you choose when you still have the choice to be human? After that final question landed like a chisel aimed at the deepest part of their awareness, the classroom fell silent. No one moved, no pages rustled, no pen rolled off a desk. Time seemed to pause inside each breath as the students sat frozen in their thick wooden chairs, their eyes quietly confronting something they'd never been asked to name before. No one spoke. No one tried to break the dense stillness with a joke or polite comment. They sat there, the way they had stood watch, written reports, checked IDs. But this time they were forced to face a version of themselves they had never fully seen, and in that silence Joelle stood tall, her hands resting lightly on the lectern, and spoke. Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but it rang clear enough that every movement in the room paused as if tethered to it. "And that," she said, "is why I'm here. Not because I was right, but because I survived." The sentence landed like a final underline beneath every justification and doubt that had ever passed through the minds of those listening. She didn't claim to be the victor. She didn't cast herself as the main character in a tragedy. She simply acknowledged one plain, cold truth. She was still here to tell the story, to make sure no one else would be forced to tell it in her place. Those words didn't stir emotions in the usual way, but made people sit in silence long after the end of class bell had rung. A male student in the back row stood up slowly, nodded slightly in thanks, then walked out, still holding his pen, having written nothing more. A female student carefully flipped to the last page of her notebook, drew a line across it, then wrote, "Surviving is not a victory, but it is proof." That sentence was later shared by many students not as a slogan, but as a reminder of the first time they were forced to choose silence in order to truly listen. And from that moment on, Joelle's lesson was no longer just a class. It became the first test that each person had to grade for themselves. After the trial, after the lessons, after the dense stream of news coverage, people began to look to Joelle as a symbol to lead conversations about justice and courage. Major media outlets took turns sending exclusive interview offers, promising prime-time national exposure and the chance to share her personal perspective with millions of viewers, looking for a face to place their trust in. But Joelle declined, without hesitation. In the only reply she sent to 3 major newsrooms, she wrote, "I am not the main character. I am just a small mirror. If this story is too big to reflect in one person, then let it reflect on the collective. That brief response was quoted in broadcasts with all kinds of emotional tones, but the public largely understood right away she was not seeking the spotlight. She was seeking a quiet space where others could hear their own conscience without being distracted by titles or personal circumstances. That same week, a public high school in the suburbs held a special discussion event titled "Choosing Not to Be Afraid, Is That a Privilege?" They didn't invite Joelle to speak, nor did they feature her image as a stage backdrop. Instead, they asked students to prepare questions centered on courage, silence, and the limits of endurance. The students were encouraged to write down their thoughts before sharing them. On a printed A4 sheet, a 16-year-old girl wrote, "Do we really get to choose not to be afraid? Or are there people who aren't allowed to be, because if they show it, they'll be swallowed whole?" That question was read aloud in the quiet auditorium, like a moment no one had planned for. A teacher raised her hand to share, "As a woman of color, I've taught while always worrying that no one in class saw me as a teacher, but I never thought that was something I could say out loud to my students. Now, I think differently." The event wasn't live streamed and no media teams came to cover it, but a clip filmed by a student's phone captured the moment when everyone stood as a small board lit up with the words, "Silence also has a limit," and it quickly spread across social media. Without needing to mention Joelle by name, people still understood the event was a consequence of a case that had seemed closed. And precisely because it didn't focus on her, the message became even clearer. This wasn't a story about a woman being hit in a market. It was a story about the many times invisible bias had knocked a person's worth out of their own identity. And when that person survives, they don't need to become a legend. They just need to show that silence can also have shape, shadow, and sound if we know how to listen. Joelle heard about the event from a former student who messaged her the story. She replied briefly, "That question is bigger than any lesson I ever taught." She didn't show up, didn't post anything publicly, but people still felt her presence like a quiet foundation, like gravity, keeping the conversation balanced from tipping into pity or attack. Later forums kept inviting her, even suggesting turning the story into a stage play or a long-term teaching resource. She declined with the same reason: "As long as people are still asking questions, it's not my turn to speak more." Even while avoiding the spotlight, Joelle never left society's line of sight, because the way she chose to step back at the right time made others step forward. They began to look around, to question their colleagues, friends, and strangers about the biases they carried but never examined, and they started to speak of Joelle as a test. If that happened to her, would we realize we were once on the wrong side too? That question didn't need an immediate answer, but it planted the seed for change. And so Joelle didn't need to stand at the center of the story to push people out of their comfort zones. She just needed to stand, calm, clear, and knowing when to pause so others could begin. The conversation at the high school lasted nearly 2 hours, seeming to touch every angle: fear, limits, silence, and the personal choice when facing injustice. When the teacher thanked the students for their courage and sharing, and the session seemed done, a small hand rose from the middle row. It was a child, maybe 10, allowed to attend with their older sister in the grade above. The child's voice wasn't loud, but clear enough that everyone turned. What if she sees them again? The question landed without suspicion or challenge, as if spoken on behalf of the hundreds of adults who had avoided their own reflection. The room fell silent again. Those who thought they knew Joelle's story had to hear it now from a view unclouded by politics, bias, or grown-up fatigue. Joelle didn't answer right away. She looked at the child for a few seconds, as if weighing words not to be right, but to fit the growing mind in front of her. Then she said slowly, "I'll look them in the eye, like I did before, so they can see themselves in mine." That answer wasn't a claim of courage or forgiveness. It was a way of being, a choice to hold dignity without needing to accuse. She didn't say she'd forgive, didn't say she'd confront. She only made clear she would not look away. And when someone is calm enough to hold their gaze before the person who tried to erase them, that silence becomes a mirror, one the other must face if they're still able to see truth. Joelle's words were recorded by a student sitting in the front row, then circulated across educational forums as a reminder of the moral posture a leader must maintain when power is no longer a tool for resistance, but a way to exist within the limits of being human. In the days that followed, someone printed her response on plain paper and posted it on the school bulletin board. Someone else copied it by hand onto their notebook cover, as if wanting to hold on to it as part of a lesson not found in any curriculum. A literature teacher chose to include the quote in a midterm essay prompt, asking students to analyze the meaning of looking directly in moments when no one believes a gaze can change anything. Most students answered by retelling stories they'd seen, of relatives, friends, teachers, or themselves being judged by bias, and they said the hardest part wasn't responding, but holding their gaze steady when they knew the other person didn't want to see their own reflection in it. Joelle didn't return to the school that day, nor did she know. The conversation ended in a silence so long that no one wanted to be the first to leave their seat. But her presence lingered, like a quiet warmth in a room made cold by stories too hard to say out loud. And that answer, simple, brief, sharp as a blade slicing through the thick skin of avoidance, showed that courage sometimes isn't in speaking loudly, but in keeping one's gaze clear, unblurred by resentment or wounds. When someone can look directly at the person who once brought them down, not with the intent to hurt, but simply to let that person see a reflection of themselves they can't deny, that's no longer just a personal act. It becomes a living lesson that a whole generation can carry. And so, the conversation ended in silence. But from that silence, something else began to grow. A desire to live in such a way that when someone looks into your eyes, they don't see cowardice, but the outline of a human who knows exactly who they are. One late autumn afternoon, when public attention had quieted and the newspapers had begun shifting to other topics, a video, less than a minute long, suddenly surfaced on social media. The footage, grainy and shot with a hidden camera, showed Kurt Halley sitting with his head bowed in a bare room, dim yellow light casting shadows over a table cluttered with scraps of paper. In his hand was a folded sheet, written in slanted, plain handwriting. He read it line by line, never looking at the camera, his voice hoarse, swallowed into his throat. As the clip ended, viewers noticed the strangest thing. The page had no signature. He called it an apology that doesn't ask for forgiveness, addressed to the one who stood firm as I fell apart, but he never wrote a name. No one knew who he meant it for or if he ever planned to send it, but in the way the words appeared on screen, people felt something had been written, not to make amends, but as the final confession of someone who had seen himself clearly once. Power no longer protected him. Joelle made no mention of the video, didn't share it, and gave no response of any kind. But a few weeks later, during a regular lecture at the police academy, she entered the classroom with a folded piece of paper in her hand. As the session neared its end, she didn't return to the lesson, didn't pose another question. Instead, she looked out at the students and said, "I want you to hear a passage. I'm not asking for your thoughts, just your attention." Then she read slowly, line by line, the exact content of the handwritten letter Kurt had written. "I was afraid when I found out she was the police chief, but I was more afraid when I realized I had never asked her name. I didn't think a look could show me who I was. But that day, when she didn't look away, I understood it wasn't a threat. It was a mirror held straight to the part of me I'd hidden all my life." No one breathed heavily while she read. Each word dropped onto the old wooden desks, echoing quietly through the minds of everyone in the room. When she finished, she folded the paper again, offered no comment, and gave no interpretation. The students didn't ask anything, but it was that silence after the reading stopped that made the words more vivid than any explanation could. In that moment, no one needed to know whether the letter was truly Kurt's or who had filmed the video. The more important question was, why does it take losing everything for a person to see the truth in what they once dismissed? And why, throughout the time he wore a badge, did Kurt never think to ask the name of the woman he struck in front of hundreds? Joelle didn't call it an apology, nor did she consider it an act of courage. But the fact that she read it word for word to her students in the middle of a lecture no one expected to shift course was her way of handing them proof that sometimes change doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the willingness to write down what no one asked to be written. More than that, she let the students decide for themselves. Would they choose to learn from the first or from the second page? A faculty member sitting in on the class later said she didn't answer the letter, but by bringing it into the room, she made others answer it for themselves. This wasn't a lesson in procedure or professional ethics anymore. It was a reminder that on the other side of people who once did harm are still people, and only when seen with an unwavering gaze do they truly recognize their own face for the first time. In many later classes, students began carrying blank sheets of paper, no names, no notes, as if saving space for something they hadn't yet written but knew they'd one day have to face. And each time they saw her walk in, set her bag down, eyes calm as they had been that first day in the market, they knew the silence wasn't empty, it was what made words matter. Because when someone who survived doesn't condemn, but instead brings in the words of the one who struck her, unedited and untouched, it doesn't need to be called noble, it is dignity. And it's enough to remind everyone that no matter which side they stand on, eventually each person must say their real name, through action or through words that need no signature. When the final line of the letter was read aloud in that classroom, the room fell into a silence so sharp that even breathing became distinct. I was afraid when I found out she was the police chief, but I was more afraid when I realized I had never asked her name. Those words, though unsigned without ornate apologies, remained like a clean cut across the hardened surface of the listener's thoughts. They offered no justification, no emphasis on consequence or injustice, only the admission of something that seemed small but was, in truth, the most serious. Someone had hurt a person without ever knowing her name. Joelle folded the paper after reading it, laid it gently on the desk, then looked straight at the row of students still pinned in place by the silence. Without elaboration, without another word of lecture, she simply said, "My name is Joelle." Not everyone understood why she chose to respond with that sentence, but for those who have felt the stripping away of identity in the face of injustice, that answer carried the weight of a lifetime. She didn't say, "I forgive," didn't say, "I remember," and certainly didn't say, "You don't deserve to know my name." She simply reclaimed the full existence of herself in an introduction, the kind of introduction someone else should have asked for at the very beginning, before imposing authority, before striking, before crushing the right to exist as an individual. Her name, not paired with a title, not attached to a badge, not followed by a rank, was the only thing she chose to say after everything, and that alone was enough to redefine the entire incident, not from her side, but from the side of those who once looked at her with suspicion, who scoffed when she said she was in charge, who turned away when she was pinned to the pavement like someone without a name. One student in the class that day recalled that after Joelle said those words, no one moved for almost a full minute. "I used to think names were the first thing people asked when they met, but I never thought someone could be denied the right to have a name just because others thought they didn't look like someone with authority." That line was quoted in a short post that circulated across the school's internal network, becoming a prompt for discussions about invisible bias in law enforcement. Another faculty member commented, "When Joelle said her name, she wasn't taking something back for herself. She was reminding us of the minimum every person deserves, to be called by the name they've had since birth." The story of the unsigned letter and Joelle's 6-word reply spread beyond the academy, featured in human rights conferences and used as a case study in professional ethics classes at law and journalism school. Debates followed. Was Kurt's act genuine? Should Joelle have responded more forcefully? And was silence, followed by a name, enough to be considered a closing statement? But amid those arguments, one thing was universally agreed upon. Joelle's way of holding on to dignity without displaying force made others stop and measure the distance between action and consequence. She didn't need anyone to name her first. She said it herself, to remind everyone that the man who hit her, who searched her purse, who questioned even the badge in her hand, had all missed the most basic truth. She is, Joelle, a human being, a person with a name. And that name didn't come from rank, wasn't born of status, wasn't used to intimidate or establish power. It was the embodiment of independent existence, untouchable and beyond anyone's right to deny. Later, many students still remembered that exact moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it gave them the feeling of seeing justice appear not through shouting or a gavel, but through a calm, brief, and indisputable sentence. And they understood that in this profession, sometimes the most powerful thing is not the right to judge others, but the ability to stand still, hold on to your name when others have tried to take it away. On Saturday morning, the farmers' market was as crowded as every week. The sound of fruit stalls, the smell of freshly peeled oranges, the laughter of children running around the pastry stands, everything felt familiar, as if nothing had ever happened. But when Joelle Ferris stepped into that market, for the first time since that fateful morning, no one saw her presence as ordinary. No one saw her presence as ordinary. She walked slowly past the vegetable stalls, not in uniform, without a badge, and without the stern expression of someone who had once been the focus of millions of eyes. She was just a woman shopping, her hair loose like in the old video, her old earth-colored canvas shoes dusty on the polished brick floor. No one crowded around her, no phones were raised, but with every step she took, eyes followed, quietly, without intrusion. She stopped in front of the first fruit stand, where crates of apples were stacked in color from green to deep red. An elderly man stood behind, sun-worn face, voice slightly raspy but eyes bright. He looked up, recognized her, and said nothing, just held out an apple toward her. Joelle took it, nodded slightly, a hint of a smile on her face, and in that moment, the market seemed to pause in a single breath. No one pushed forward, no one stepped in, but everyone saw that something had just been restored. Not justice, but a presence free from fear. She continued walking through the stalls, occasionally leaning to examine some onions, a bunch of dill, and then stood for a long time in front of a small stand selling dried lavender. The vendor, a middle-aged woman, had been at the trial, had written a public apology afterward for not speaking up sooner. Their eyes met briefly, then the woman placed a bouquet into a paper bag, set it silently on the table, and didn't take payment. Joelle didn't refuse and didn't thank her with words. She nodded again, and that was enough to say everything that needed saying. No one asked for photos. No one asked how she felt. No one called her police chief or the woman in the video. People addressed her with their eyes, with space left open for her to write her own name. On the cobblestone path leading out to the parking lot, a little girl around 7 stood next to her mother, sneaking glances at Joelle. She stopped, crouched down to the girl's eye level, and didn't say a word. The girl held out a sticker of a purple police shield, unclear where it came from, and said, "You keep this, 'cause you're brave." Joelle took it, held the small hand in hers for a moment, then walked away without looking back. But by then the whole market had paused in a short step, as if to make sure that this return was hers fully, not out of pity or praise, but as the rightful return of someone who had once been pushed aside and now stepped into the center on her own. As she disappeared behind the row of cars, those who had stood watching from a distance quietly returned to their stalls. No one talked, no one brought it up, but inside each of them, something had shifted, because they knew her return wasn't because she had forgotten, and certainly not because she needed forgiveness. It was because she understood that the place that once stripped part of her identity was exactly where she needed to walk back into, as the one who owns her own presence. Joelle didn't need to be acknowledged. She needed to walk without being blocked, and on that day, under the light early-season sun, among the familiar calls and hurried footsteps, that seemingly small act became a bell ringing in the city's heart, that a woman had returned to the very place that once tried to erase her, and stood there as if she had never been pushed out, not to reclaim justice, but to redefine what it means to belong. Joelle kept walking along the path between the rows of fruit and vegetable stalls, her steps steady, as if this had never been the site of a punch that had shaken an entire city. Each vendor, each shopper seemed silently reminded of something. Today, she wasn't here to be noticed, but to reclaim the ground once taken from the way she carried herself. No one approached for photos. No one pulled out a phone to film her steps. There were no whispers, no scrutinizing stares, no voices calling out behind her, but every time she moved forward, people stepped aside, forming a narrow path just wide enough for her to walk straight without having to dodge anyone, without having to brace herself against any invisible walls. Those small gestures of space weren't written into any code of conduct nor ordered by anyone. They came like a reflex from a community that had come to understand. Her passing through today wasn't just a trip to the market, but a continuation of a journey to reclaim the right to exist in her full form. As the sunlight began to spill onto the market floor, catching the floating dust like a thin mist, Joelle stopped at the handmade honey stall, the one she used to visit every weekend. The vendor didn't look at her with awe, didn't greet her with fanfare, just scooped a bit of honey, placed it on a small piece of bread, and held it out. She took it, brought it to her lips, the gentle sweetness dissolving slowly, then gave a slow nod. That was the moment, as if an invisible bell had rung through the market. Her face softened, her eyes relaxed, and her mouth curved into a quiet smile. It was her first smile in 37 long days, since that morning when a badge-bearing hand struck her face in front of the crowd that filled this very place. Not a smile of triumph or vindication, but the kind of smile a person gives when they know they can smile without needing to be on guard. Failed a smile that returned at the exact moment nothing needed defending anymore. Many people in the market at that moment paused, even if just for a few seconds, to witness it. Not because they expected to see any particular expression from her, but because they wanted to be sure that the woman who had once been dragged away like someone without a name could now smile as herself. There was no applause. No one ran up to congratulate her. But in that moment, everyone silently understood that her smile was the most valuable thing that had ever appeared here, more than any headline, any argument, or any courtroom verdict. Because justice doesn't end with a ruling, but with the moment someone who had been stripped of their worth can smile without needing permission. Joelle turned and headed toward the exit, past the bread stall, past the stone bench where the little boy once asked his mother why someone had hit her. The bench was still there, the paint faded, but no question mark hung in the air anymore. She walked past it, her heart undisturbed. Each step seemed to echo the answer she had been saving for more than a month, not in words, but in presence. No badge, no title, no camera tracking her, yet people still paused and made way, not out of fear, but because they had learned how to recognize dignity in the quiet stride of someone once denied. And when she disappeared around the final corner, the sun rose higher, the calls of vendors continued, and daily routines slowly resumed. But in that place, the trail she left wasn't marked on the pavement, but in the way people began to look at each other, more slowly, more carefully, and with an awareness that could no longer be erased. One weekend morning, at the southeast corner of the farmers' market, near the spot where the incident that shook the entire city had taken place, a group of workers mounted a gleaming brass plaque onto the old brick wall. The face of the plaque bore bold, clean lines, like a declaration. This is where the police chief was humiliated because of her skin color and did not retaliate. The words were not meant to evoke pity or stoke anger, but to serve as a reminder of a moment that exposed the core of a system, and from that exposure opened the door to healing. There was no grand unveiling ceremony, no media coverage, but within 2 hours of the plaque being put up, the first footsteps had already paused before it. A group of teenagers in school athletic uniforms from the nearby high school approached, standing in a row before the plaque. They weren't loud, didn't pose theatrically, just took one photo together, hands over hearts, heads slightly bowed. One of them later posted the image on social media with the caption, "Where we learned the strength of silence." That post was shared tens of thousands of times, not because of the poster's fame, but because it captured something many had witnessed but never knew how to put into words. The photo showed no tension, no dramatics, just young faces standing before a plaque that told the story of a city's wound, which had now become a lesson a new generation chose to carry forward. In the following days, people continued to stop by in small groups. An elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years brought their grandchild to read the plaque aloud like a bedtime story. A group of law students came to quietly document every detail of the setting for a research project. Others simply stood and looked, taking a photo on their phones without posting it anywhere, as if needing to keep a private reminder. Someone had once been assaulted here for a reason that had no place in any profession, skin color, and someone had chosen not to retaliate, choosing instead a silence that forced the system to speak for itself. At first, some were skeptical about the plaque. They worried it would reopen old wounds and deepen the pain of the person who had been the victim. But gradually, they realized that engraving those words into stone was the very act that kept the event from being erased from the community's memory. It stood as proof that the city had grown enough not to hide what was shameful, but to mark it as a turning point. A university professor wrote in the local column, "This plaque doesn't aim to glorify anyone. It exists so no one can say, 'I didn't know that happened.' And because of that, no one felt the need to place flowers or candles beneath it. There was no need to turn the site into a shrine. It already lived as part of the space, quiet and enduring." Joelle didn't attend the day the plaque was installed. She heard about it through a message from someone she knew, then saw the photo of the student group online. She didn't share it, didn't comment. But the next morning, a nearby vendor said someone had stopped by very early, before the market got busy. The person wore a hat and sunglasses, stood in front of the plaque for nearly 10 minutes without moving, then left. The vendor wasn't sure if it was Joelle, and didn't need to be, because what mattered more was this: whoever it was didn't come to be seen, but to see again the very place that once tried to erase her from the map of dignity. And when she left, what remained behind was a brass plaque glowing in the sunlight, not because of its shine, but because of the weight of what had been written. Undeniable, irreversible. A story that once was a wound had become a line that couldn't be ignored. A place that once held a question had become an answer, not just for one person, but for the entire city. At a police academy seminar a few days after the plaque was installed, the session titled "Preserving Dignity in Action" drew a large crowd of young cadets. Joelle's name wasn't listed among the featured speakers, but she sat quietly in the guest section, listening through the panels, occasionally jotting notes. During the open floor portion, a young female officer, around 25, with short-cropped hair and a steady stance, asked to speak. Her voice didn't shake, but carried the careful tone of someone aware she was sharing something personal in a public setting. She looked toward Joelle and said slowly, "If I could choose again from the start, I'd choose like you did." The room didn't erupt in applause, but the energy shifted. People turned to look, not out of curiosity, but as if pulled into a moment they hadn't quite anticipated. The moment when a young officer openly admired someone not for her rank or record, but for holding on to her dignity, even when her identity had been denied. That woman didn't say she wanted to be the police chief for the bravest person in the room. She just chose like you, meaning to stand tall even when doubted, to refuse retaliation when humiliated, to quietly hold ground without trading away her soul for a voice. Joelle leaned toward the mic after the comment, without smiling, without a grateful pat on the shoulder. Her voice was calm, each word clear like a knock on wood. "You don't need to be like me. Just don't be like him." The answer wasn't a lesson, nor was it false humility. It was a direct message, drawn from the life she had lived. She didn't want anyone to be her replica, didn't want to be held up as an ideal. The only thing she asked was that those who put on that uniform not follow the path Kurt had taken. Because if even one more person walked walked into this job thinking power means permission to trample, then every lesson, every ruling, every brass plaque installed would mean nothing. The hall fell silent after her response. It wasn't an awkward silence, but a profound one, like the collective exhale of people who had just received a gentle yet razor-sharp awakening. The young female officer nodded, her eyes still fixed on Joelle. A faculty member near the door whispered to a colleague, "That's the kind of honesty only someone who doesn't need to be forgiven can speak." The seminar didn't end with applause, but with rows of people, rising one by one, quietly stepping out, carrying those words with them like a pane of glass placed between themselves and power. In the weeks that followed, the phrase, "You don't need to be like me, just don't be like him," began appearing in the Academy's training notebooks, not as a slogan, but as a handwritten note in the margins of the lesson. Former students started quoting it during discussions on professional ethics, and mid-level officers used it to remind their teams during shift briefings. It wasn't meant to glorify Joelle, but to highlight the core truth the profession had long overlooked, that the evil within a system doesn't begin with major decisions, but with the small things people choose to normalize. And if every young recruit entering the force could remind themselves not to repeat a glance, a word, or a punch like Kurt's, then maybe the future of this profession wouldn't require plaques to remember old lessons. In that future, Joelle would no longer be the central figure, just someone who once passed through. And maybe that's exactly what she hoped for most. After months of being discussed in classrooms, seminars, news reports, and even cited in hundreds of graduation essays, the name Joelle Ferris appeared unexpectedly in a completely different space. Not on television or in college lectures, but in the first episode of a brand new podcast created by a group of high school students titled "The Generation That Doesn't Bow Its Head." The name didn't scream or confront, but carried a quiet conviction as firm as steel. This generation would stand tall, no matter which way the wind blew. The podcast wasn't recorded in a soundproof studio, had no edited music beds, just honest conversations captured on a phone mic, with the hum of a fan in the background and the occasional laugh woven through serious stories. And perhaps that's why the invitation they sent Joelle felt unexpected, simple, and firm. Just like how they had followed her journey without embellishing it. No flowers, no name tags, no scripted intros. They invited her for one reason only, to ask, "How do you stay silent without giving in?" The question came from a 12th grader, voice not quite steady but firm, like it had lived in her chest since the first day she learned about Joelle. The group sat around a small wooden table, one microphone in the center. No notebooks, no recording equipment. They didn't ask Joelle to recount the event, didn't mention the video, and didn't circle around the media storm. They simply wanted to know, how do you stay yourself when the world keeps trying to bend you into its mold? Joelle was silent for a few seconds, then answered in a quieter voice than usual. No lecture, no breakdown, just like she was speaking to herself. Not all silence is surrender. Some silence is to hear clearly who you are. The answer landed like early rain, gentle, but enough to make you stop. No one reacted right away. The students sat still, like they had just been handed a kind of language not found in textbooks, yet instantly understood. A girl with curly hair and thick glasses, sitting next to Joelle, whispered, "I think sometimes I confuse silence with giving in." Joelle turned to her, her gaze softening. "That confusion is easy, but once you know what your silence is for, you'll know when it's time to speak." They sat together like longtime friends, sharing something that didn't need to be said aloud, that growing up begins the moment you dare to look into your silence and ask, why? The episode was uploaded to free platforms, drawing just a few hundred plays in the first week, but most listeners made it through every second. No one skipped, no one left long comments, but the numbers didn't drop. They quietly kept rising day after day. Hell, that thing looked like it erupted day after day. How could anyone just disappear? Hell, the numbers didn't drop, they quietly kept rising day after day. Joelle's words became the title of that podcast episode. "Not All Silence is Surrender" was printed on T-shirts designed by the students themselves, sold to raise funds to keep the program going. They didn't seek major sponsorships or ask for school backing, wanting to preserve that voice in its full form. unfiltered by conditions or limits. In the end-of-semester homeroom session, when asked to write one sentence to describe the past year, over half the class chose Joelle's quote instead of citing textbooks or teachers. And in the way they wrote that sentence, by hand, unedited, untemplated, it was clear that voice had landed exactly where it needed to. It was no longer a lesson on justice, but a way for a generation to learn how to become themselves, even through a kind of purposeful quiet. And from that, the silence was no longer a void. It became a voice that didn't need to be loud to be remembered. From the moment Joelle answered that question in her steady voice, the air in the small podcast room grew thick, as if everything else had stepped back to make space for a sentence just deep and open enough not to need explanation. Not all silence is surrender. Some silence is to hear clearly who you are. The sentence rang out in a circle of young faces, not like a typical answer, but like something carved inward, a line that became a marker, a part of thought that couldn't be undone. After the recording ended, the students stayed behind. No one rushed to leave. They sat in that silence for a long time, not because they ran out of questions, but because they had just been filled with something they hadn't had words for before. In that shared stillness, one student suggested, "This should be our slogan." No one disagreed. There was no vote. The sentence simply became the label for what they were doing. A group of regular students daring to ask questions bigger than their exams, daring to listen to truths that adults sometimes avoided. They printed the line on banners, placed it on the homepage of their podcast, stamped it on notebook covers, and sent it to every guest as a thank you. When asked why they chose that quote from everything that had been shared, the group's content writer answered simply, "Because this line doesn't teach you how to react, it teaches you how to be present." What made it powerful was that it wasn't shocking, it wasn't rebellious, it wasn't tied to any defiant slogan. It didn't call for action, it called for understanding. The kind that begins by accepting that silence has layers, and not every layer means giving up. In the weeks that followed, high schools across the area began to notice the podcast group, the generation that doesn't bow, not just because of the sharp questions its members posed, but because of how they kept Joelle's story from slipping into pity or hero worship. They didn't retell her life as a string of injustices, but as an example of choice. A choice to keep her name, to keep her gaze steady, to hold a stance free of hatred while refusing to overlook wrongdoing. That slogan, when posted on the bulletin board of another high school, made many students stop and read carefully, then start to talk. Some understood for the first time that not speaking up immediately doesn't mean indifference, and that silence doesn't mean a lack of conviction. One student wrote in an essay, "For the first time I saw silence with shape. It stood, not knelt. It watched, not turned away." Joelle was informed of this through a message from the podcast team. She read it, didn't respond right away, just saved the photo of the bulletin board with the slogan that a student had sent along. A few days later, she replied with one line, "When a sentence travels farther than the person who spoke it, it has lived a life of its own." To Joelle, what mattered wasn't whether her name was still mentioned, but whether the silence she once chose was being better understood by each new generation. That sentence had traveled from a small podcast to a classroom, then printed on a schoolyard board, and from there entered a larger conversation that no one imagined began with a trial, a punch, or a bruise on a cheek. Now, it was a different kind of voice, one that didn't need to be loud but was strong enough to remind young people learning to grow up that some things can't be taught in books, but can be learned from how someone holds their silence without giving up who they are. And in that way, the sentence was no longer just a slogan, it became a vow, written in the steady, quiet presence of Joelle Ferris. The final training session for new police officers took place in a simple meeting room, white lights shining down on rough wooden tables. There were no motivational banners, just a series of situational questions projected on the screen. Among them, one question appeared last, not bolded, not italicized, but when it showed up, the room fell into an unusual silence. "If you encounter someone like Joelle Ferris, what would you do?" The instructor didn't stress it, just paused for a few seconds, then let the trainees answer for themselves. A young man in the second row, just 23, raised his hand. He didn't lift his head high, didn't look around, just answered briefly and firmly, "I'd ask for their name before asking for ID." No one applauded, no one gasped, but the entire room seemed to contract for a beat, because in that one reply was the full weight of a 20-part story, succinct, complete, and carrying the depth of hard-earned growth without restating the pain. That response spread beyond the room, not through live streams or recordings, but by word of mouth. Those present repeated it to co-workers, to supervisors, to the next class. It was written on the whiteboard in the break room, mentioned during shifts when discussing first contact protocols. Gradually, it became a way to measure change. Where officers were once trained to identify threats by instinct, now the first question being encouraged was an act of humanity. Ask for a name as a way to first acknowledge that the person in front of you is someone with an identity, a history, and a worth before being placed within a system. That gesture was so small it could have seemed inconsequential, but in a field long driven by reflex and ingrained bias, it marked a structural shift. Joelle didn't know that young officer's name, and didn't need to. But if someone were to tell her about that answer, she would likely just smile, because she never wished to be reenacted, only for her story not to be repeated. And now that someone has chosen to begin by asking for a name, not to control but to connect, then what she once guarded in silence has found its rightful place. The story doesn't need another chapter, because the needed shift has already begun, sparked by the smallest of actions. Not out of outrage, not out of reform agendas, but from a simple, decent question. And sometimes history doesn't change direction through protest, but through a single question: what's your name? The story of Joelle Ferris began on what seemed like an ordinary morning at a familiar market, where she was beaten, handcuffed, and searched in front of a crowd by officers who should have recognized her, their own chief. From that moment, a chain reaction no one could have predicted began to unfold, not through shouting or declarations of war, but through silence, through eyes that didn't look away, through the decision to hold on to dignity in the storm of prejudice. Joelle didn't turn herself into a victim or a symbol. She let the system indict itself through the actions, the words, the looks of those who abused power. And then, one by one, phones were pulled out, videos were shared, and questions were raised. What made someone seem invisible until a police chief ID card appeared? But what people remembered wasn't the title she held. It was how she carried herself when it was stripped away. From courtroom to classroom, podcast to the quiet bronze plaque by the market wall, every space echoed the same truth. Justice doesn't live in grand statements, but in how clearly we see one another before we act. And from her story, the next generation didn't learn to react faster. They learned to pause and ask, "What's your name?" Joelle Ferris reminded us that the most important lessons aren't written in law, but found in the eyes of those brave enough to meet your gaze. And in the end, she didn't need a badge for people to know who she was. The lesson left behind isn't in the penal code, isn't written into training manuals, and doesn't wait at the end of a chain of command. It lives in a look steady enough to see a human being, not a threat. What happened to Joelle Ferris is no longer an isolated incident trotted out at symposiums. It's become a moral checkpoint where the system must reflect, not through argument, but through how people behave when no cameras are watching. When a young officer says he'd ask for a name before asking for ID, that isn't a pledge to reform, it's proof that change is taking root in daily gestures, where those who wear the uniform choose to begin with listening instead of judgment. And there, in the quiet choices repeated over time, the core lesson takes shape, that professional ethics don't come from an entrance exam, but from every moment we meet the truth with our eyes open. And Joelle, after everything, no longer needs a badge or a title for others to know who she is. She no longer walks into rooms with a nameplate on her chest, nor does she need a police escort or reporters to establish her place. People recognize her by the calm way she walks, by a presence that sharpens the air around her, by the way she sits in silence and makes every word nearby turn honest. Her identity no longer rests in a piece of leather embossed with gold letters, but in how those who once doubted or passed her by now slow down, make way, and listen. She has walked through the days when people looked at her with prejudice in their eyes, endured silence mistaken for submission, and worn the bruise from a punch on her face without striking back. And now that very silence has become a language more powerful than any indictment, one that forces society to ask itself how it treats someone before knowing who they are. Now, Joelle appears in sociology textbooks, in interdisciplinary research projects, in intro to ethics classes, but also in the way a child waves at a stranger without fear, in the way a police officer asks an older woman her name before requesting ID, in the way a student chooses to listen to an entire story before crafting a counter-argument. She has become part of the unspoken framework that redefines what it means to be present, that a person deserves respect not because of what they do, but because they exist. And when a city can see someone like Joelle without needing plaques, citations, or applause, that city has begun to move into another phase, where people don't have to prove they're worthy of eye contact, where dignity comes without conditions, where memory is no longer pushed to the edges. In that current, Joelle is no longer at the center. She's no longer cast as a symbol in the story, but as a natural part of a shared civic consciousness. She still shops for groceries, still visits her usual cafe, still gives the occasional small interview, but her voice grows lighter, as if each word is now used more carefully because she knows society has started to speak on her behalf. And in the moment someone walks past her, not out of curiosity but with the quiet knowledge that she belongs here like anyone else, equality stops being a slogan. It becomes reality. Joelle doesn't need her identity affirmed, because now, when she shows up, no one asks, "Who are you?" They only ask themselves, "Am I ready to be seen by someone like her?" That is the end point of a journey, not with a period but with an open gaze, where the lesson is handed off, quietly, but in a way that cannot be forgotten. Joelle Ferris walked a path no one chooses, but some are forced to take. From the sidewalk where she was assaulted in broad daylight, to hundreds of classrooms, courtrooms, seminar halls, and student-run podcasts, it all began with a single punch. What seemed like an isolated incident but ended up exposing a deeply rooted structure of power, prejudice, and disregard for human dignity. She didn't scream, didn't fight back in the way many expected, but held on to a kind of silence that forced everyone to face themselves. From her gaze, people had to ask, "When have I looked at someone as if they had no name, no rights, no worth, to stand beside me?" This wasn't just a story about one officer abusing power or a system without checks. It was about how a woman held on to her identity in the harshest circumstances, with a steady presence that needed no explanation. From a marketplace, Joelle entered the minds of thousands, not through speeches or campaigns, but by standing tall without lowering her eyes. She didn't try to become a symbol, didn't need others to rewrite anything for her, and because of that, her story reached further. It lives in the way people now ask for a name before asking for credentials, in how a younger generation creates space for voices once seen as too small, in the quiet but steady shift where a single look can reshape how we think about justice. Joelle didn't win, she kept what was true, the part most people drop while chasing status. And that calm presence made the city relearn how to live together, not through commands, but through understanding. The biggest lesson didn't come from a courtroom or council hall, but from the moment she smiled for the first time after 37 days, walking through that same old market with the ease of someone who carries no explanation for the bruise that was once on her cheek. The lesson was simple. Dignity doesn't come from what we're called, but from whether we can walk into the world without having to prove we belong. And from that journey, people learned that some changes don't start with chance, but with silence that holds weight. Some people don't need a podium to teach, just enough steadiness in a storm to show others they're unshaken. Joelle didn't fall. More importantly, she didn't make others feel small. She made them want to stand, to move forward, and to hold on to a kind of quiet strength that keeps them from harming, a kind of clarity that doesn't need to prove itself. And if anyone asks, what did she leave behind for this city? The answer isn't a plaque or a media story, but a new principle. Ask someone their name before you decide who they are.